War is not only about tanks, maps, and generals. It is about people. Ordinary men, women, and children caught in the storm of history, suffering in ways too cruel to imagine. Tonight, we journey deep into the Battle of Kharkov, 1943, Germany's last great victory on the Eastern Front. A battle where frozen streets became graveyards, where soldiers fought in brutal close combat, and where countless lives were shattered forever. But this is not just about strategy. It is about the human cost. The fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the unimaginable pain endured by those who lived and died in this desperate struggle. These are the kinds of haunting experiences we explore in our playlist, Human Stories of History, where you can find more accounts of deadly battles, cruel suffering, and stories that remind us of the true price of war. If you value these untold histories, please subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us keep these human stories alive and remembered. Now let's step back to 1943 and uncover the chilling human side of Kharkov. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Frozen Battlefield, setting the stage for Kharkov 1943. The early months of 1943 on the Eastern Front were a grim theater of war, where ice, mud, and exhaustion shaped the fates of millions. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht was reeling, yet the echoes of its former strength still lingered, poised to exploit any missteps by the advancing Soviet forces. Kharkov, a vital industrial and transportation hub in eastern Ukraine, had already changed hands several times since the war began. Its steel factories, railways, and urban infrastructure made it an irresistible prize for both sides, a symbol of control in the unforgiving landscape of the Eastern Front. As winter tightened its grip, the city and its surrounding steppes became the stage for one of the most remarkable tactical maneuvers of the Second World War, a battle where strategy, weather, and sheer human resilience converged. The German forces, though weakened, retained pockets of elite units, particularly the SS Panzer Corps and elements of the Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions. These units, seasoned by years of conflict and tempered in earlier campaigns, were the instruments through which Field Marshal Erich von Manstein sought to reverse the momentum that had turned decisively in favor of the Soviets. Manstein, renowned for his operational brilliance and audacious tactics, understood that the Red Army, flush with victory after Stalingrad, risked overextension. Its supply lines were stretched thin, its troops often exhausted, and its command structure still adapting to the massive gains in manpower and equipment. Kharkov's location, at the intersection of major rail lines and road networks, made it not only a logistical target, but a pivot for maneuvering armies, where control could determine the flow of the entire Southern Front. Soviet forces, energized by the fall of Stalingrad and the encirclement of the German Sixth Army, advanced into eastern Ukraine with a mixture of confidence and caution. The Red Army's strategy relied heavily on rapid penetration and encirclement, seeking to exploit weaknesses in the German lines and liberate key cities before the enemy could regroup. However, the sheer expanse of territory and the harsh winter conditions posed serious challenges. Roads became quagmires of mud as temperatures fluctuated around freezing, and frozen rivers acted both as obstacles and potential highways, depending on their condition. Soviet planners had to contend with these logistical realities while managing the expectations of a high command eager for decisive victories. As January and February progressed, the front lines around Kharkov became a network of trenches, fortified positions, and improvised defenses. Both sides faced similar hardships: frostbite, limited supplies, and the psychological strain of constant artillery barrages. For the soldiers, The landscape itself was a formidable adversary. Forests stripped bare by winter offered little cover, while open plains exposed movements to enemy observation. In this environment, small tactical decisions could ripple into strategic consequences, and the skill of commanders in reading the terrain often determined the survival of entire units. Manstein's approach was methodical yet daring. He recognized that a direct confrontation with the advancing Soviets in open terrain would be costly, but a well-timed counteroffensive could exploit their overconfidence. The German forces began to consolidate, drawing together depleted units, refitting them with fresh armor and artillery where possible, and positioning them in concealed locations to mask their intentions. Reconnaissance and intelligence became crucial tools, allowing German commanders to anticipate Soviet movements and select the optimal moment for attack. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders, buoyed by recent successes, often underestimated the Germans' capacity for recovery and maneuver. This miscalculation would later prove pivotal in the unfolding drama around Kharkov. In addition to the military and geographical considerations, Kharkov held symbolic significance. Its liberation by the Red Army would be heralded as a sign of unstoppable momentum, while a German victory could serve as a testament to the resilience of an army thought broken. Propaganda and morale, often underestimated, played a quiet but vital role in the preparations. For civilians caught in the crossfire, the city represented survival against the chaos of war, as families sought shelter and food amid bombed-out streets and requisitioned buildings. The interplay between military necessity and human endurance added a layer of complexity to the approaching battle, making it not only a contest of tanks and rifles, but also a test of human will in extreme conditions. As February 1943 approached its midpoint, the stage was set. The frozen battlefield around Kharkov awaited the clash of two massive armies, each believing in the inevitability of its own triumph. The coming weeks would test the limits of strategy, endurance, and leadership. The soldiers, commanders, and civilians were all actors in a drama where one misstep could mean encirclement and annihilation, and where weather, terrain, and timing held as much power as any division or corps. The frozen landscape itself seemed to whisper warnings, a silent observer to the monumental struggle about to unfold. Kharkov was no longer just a city. It was the fulcrum upon which the balance of the southern eastern front teetered, and its capture or defense would resonate far beyond the immediate battlefields. In this environment, curiosity intertwines with the harsh reality of war. How would the exhausted Wehrmacht find the strength to regroup and strike back? Could the Soviets maintain their momentum in the face of logistical strains and extreme weather? The answers lay hidden in the movements of armored divisions, in the calculations of field marshals, and in the courage of ordinary soldiers enduring one of the harshest winters in Eastern Europe. The frozen battlefield of Kharkov was not merely a setting. It was a crucible of strategy, endurance, and historical consequence, where every decision would echo across the broader canvas of World War II. The weeks leading up to the Third Battle of Kharkov were defined by a tense equilibrium. Both sides consolidated, maneuvered, and observed, each acutely aware of the stakes yet uncertain of the other's capabilities. The Soviet forces had pushed deep into eastern Ukraine, liberating towns and villages in rapid succession. Their confidence was bolstered by the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, a psychological blow that lingered in the minds of many Wehrmacht soldiers. However, the Soviets faced their own operational challenges. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers were vulnerable to counterattacks and partisan disruptions, while communication delays between frontline units and higher command often resulted in misaligned offensives. These logistical and organizational strains, invisible at first glance, were seeds of vulnerability that would be exploited in the coming conflict. For the Germans, the retreat from Stalingrad had been catastrophic but instructive. They had learned that rigid adherence to static defensive lines was unsustainable under pressure from a mobile and increasingly mechanized Red Army. Manstein's genius lay in his willingness to accept calculated risks, to employ flexible defensive positions combined with swift, decisive counterattacks. His strategy around Kharkov relied on deception, patience, and precise timing. Concealed troop movements, feigned retreats, and carefully coordinated artillery barges were intended to lure the Soviets into overextending themselves. The winter landscape, while brutal, provided an advantage. The frozen ground allowed heavy armored vehicles to traverse areas otherwise impassable in mud or snowmelt. The Wehrmacht's planners recognized that environmental conditions could be weaponized as much as tanks or infantry, transforming nature itself into a strategic ally. The city of Kharkov, scarred by repeated occupations and shelling, became a focal point of preparation and anticipation. Streets lined with bombed-out buildings, rubble-filled alleys, and ruined factories provided both obstacles and cover for the forces converging on its perimeter. Urban warfare loomed as a key component of the battle, where control of street intersections, industrial complexes, and railway yards could determine the pace of operations. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to fortify positions, erecting barricades and anti-tank obstacles, while German reconnaissance teams studied avenues of approach, identifying weak points in the Red Army's defenses. In this chessboard of destruction, every maneuver had consequences, and every oversight could lead to encirclement or annihilation. Morale played a paradoxical role. The Soviets, flush with recent victories, sometimes underestimated the enemy's resilience. Officers at various levels were under pressure to achieve rapid results, often leading to aggressive, audacious advances without sufficient support. German troops, by contrast, carried the heavy burden of past defeats, yet were buoyed by the clarity of Manstein's command and the focused purpose of a well-executed counteroffensive. The psychological dynamics of this confrontation cannot be overstated. Courage, confidence, and fear intertwined on both sides, influencing decisions as much as maps or artillery charts. The battlefield was not only physical but mental, and the ebb and flow of morale often dictated the tempo of action in ways statistics could never capture. Intelligence gathering and reconnaissance became pivotal in this prelude to battle. German signals units intercepted communications, providing glimpses into Soviet operational patterns. Scouts and reconnaissance aircraft mapped terrain and troop dispositions, identifying potential vulnerabilities in the Soviet advance. Meanwhile, the Red Army relied on both local informants and aerial observation, but rapid advances and stretched communications limited the accuracy of their intelligence. This imbalance would create opportunities for the Germans to strike decisively at the most opportune moment, exploiting gaps and weaknesses that the Soviets themselves might not have recognized. As the frozen days turned into nights, supply convoys creaked along icy roads, moving food, fuel, and ammunition to units positioned around Kharkov. Soldiers endured sub-zero temperatures, frost-bitten extremities, and the constant rumble of artillery that made the night feel alive with menace. The human dimension of this preparation was immense. Men shivering in foxholes, mechanics repairing tanks under icy winds, medics tending to frostbite and wounds, all while anticipating an engagement that could erupt at any moment. These elements of human endurance are often overshadowed in discussions of strategy, yet they were as critical to the outcome as the tanks, guns, and artillery deployed in the field. By mid-February 1943, the elements were aligned for what would become Germany's last major triumph on the Eastern Front. Manstein's forces were in position, concealed in forests, small towns, and rail embankments. The Red Army, confident but overextended, advanced toward Kharkov with momentum, unaware that the trap was already being set. The frozen battlefield itself had become a silent accomplice in the coming clash, shaping movements, slowing reinforcements, and hardening the resolve of those entrenched in the city's outskirts. In this frozen expanse of industrial ruins, open plains, and sparse woodlands, the stage was perfectly arranged for a dramatic reversal of fortune, a calculated counterstroke that would momentarily halt the seemingly unstoppable Soviet advance and inflict heavy losses. The coming days would see the fusion of strategy, timing, and human endurance into a concentrated burst of action. Kharkov was no longer merely a city. It was a crucible where the lessons of Stalingrad, the ingenuity of Manstein, and the resilience of German armored units would converge. For the soldiers in trenches and towns, for the commanders plotting movements in cold command posts, and for the civilians enduring the uncertainty of war, the frozen battlefield promised a conflict that would test every dimension of military science, leadership, and human perseverance. The anticipation, tension, and stakes created an atmosphere where history itself seemed to pause, waiting to witness the outcome of one of World War II's most remarkable confrontations. Chapter 2: The Aftermath of Stalingrad. A broken but defiant Wehrmacht. The bitter winter of 1943 left the Eastern Front scarred and fractured, both physically and psychologically. The defeat at Stalingrad had shaken the Wehrmacht to its core, claiming the lives of tens of thousands and capturing nearly an entire army in a demoralizing encirclement that reverberated through Germany and the occupied territories. Yet despite this catastrophic setback, the German army was far from collapse. The retreat from Stalingrad was not merely a withdrawal, it was a painful recalibration. Units that survived were amalgamated, replenished, and readied for defensive and counteroffensive operations. The army, though battered, retained pockets of experience, discipline, and operational acumen that would prove critical in the coming months. Kharkov became the focal point of these efforts, a proving ground where the Wehrmacht would demonstrate that even after staggering losses, strategic brilliance and the will to fight could produce moments of tactical brilliance. The soldiers who had survived Stalingrad carried with them the dual burdens of exhaustion and survival. Many had endured months of encirclement, starvation, and extreme cold, yet the discipline instilled by years of training and the leadership of commanders like Erich von Manstein ensured that these experiences translated into hard-earned wisdom rather than despair. These men were no longer naive about the scale of Soviet power, nor about the brutal realities of modern mechanized warfare. They had witnessed firsthand the consequences of overextension and miscalculation, lessons that would shape their movements and tactical decisions around Kharkov. The contrast between these veterans and the newer, less experienced troops moving in to fill the ranks created a complex dynamic, where the institutional knowledge of survival intersected with the energy and audacity of fresh reinforcements. Manstein's leadership became the axis around which the Wehrmacht's resurgence rotated. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who struggled to adapt after Stalingrad, Manstein approached the situation with a clear-eyed understanding of both his army's limitations and the Soviet army's vulnerabilities. He recognized that a head-on confrontation in open terrain was inadvisable. Instead, He sought to lure the Soviets into overcommitting to positions that appeared advantageous, only to strike decisively when their lines were stretched and their supply chains overextended. This blend of deception, patience, and rapid counterattack would come to define the Third Battle of Kharkov, illustrating that even a weakened army, under effective leadership, could impose its will upon a numerically superior opponent. The broader German command structure, though reeling from Stalingrad, still possessed formidable logistical and operational capabilities. Rail networks, fuel reserves, and experienced transport units allowed Manstein and his subordinates to reposition divisions quickly, concentrating forces where they could achieve the greatest impact. Artillery, which had proven decisive in previous engagements, was redeployed in concentrated batteries, capable of devastating Soviet positions at the moment of engagement. Tanks, particularly the Panther and Tiger variants in limited numbers, were used not only as offensive weapons, but as psychological tools, their mere presence capable of slowing enemy advances and forcing caution in Soviet planning. The German army's ability to combine mobility, firepower, and tactical patience made it a dangerous opponent. Even after suffering severe losses on the Soviet side, the victory at Stalingrad created a sense of momentum that was both empowering and perilous. While the Red Army had demonstrated the capacity to encircle and annihilate a German army, its successes also led to overconfidence. The liberation of large swathes of territory fostered a belief in invincibility, sometimes masking the logistical and operational challenges that accompanied rapid advances. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of kilometers, communication channels became fragmented, and the coordination between multiple fronts proved challenging. Soviet commanders, eager to exploit the perceived weakness of the Germans, often underestimated the capacity of surviving German units to regroup, counterattack, and inflict significant losses. This misjudgment would later prove pivotal around Kharkov, where German forces executed a masterful counterstroke. The city of Kharkov itself became a symbolic and strategic focal point in this post-Stalingrad landscape. Its industrial infrastructure, railway junctions, and proximity to the Donetsk basin made it vital for both sides. For the Germans, holding and eventually retaking Kharkov offered the possibility of restoring credibility after Stalingrad and stabilizing the southern front. For the Soviets, capturing and holding the city would cement the perception of unstoppable momentum, opening the path to further advances into Ukraine and toward the Dnieper River. The stakes were immense, extending beyond immediate military considerations to encompass morale, political messaging, and the broader narrative of the war. As winter pressed on, both armies faced not only each other, but the harsh conditions imposed by the environment. Freezing temperatures, snow-laden roads, and the constant threat of frostbite-shaped movements, operational planning, and daily routines. Soldiers dug foxholes in frozen earth, repaired vehicles in sub-zero temperatures, and rationed scarce supplies, while artillery thundered continuously along the front. The harsh climate compounded the physical and psychological pressures on troops, creating a theater of endurance where the line between survival and combat effectiveness was dangerously thin. Leadership decisions, logistical planning, and sheer human resilience became intertwined in a delicate balance that could tip the scales of battle. Within this context, the Wehrmacht's ability to regroup after Stalingrad takes on a remarkable significance. It was not merely the movement of troops and material, but the orchestration of strategy, logistics, and morale into a coherent force capable of seizing the initiative. The post-Stalingrad army was battered yet adaptive, cautious yet audacious, embodying a paradoxical combination of vulnerability and latent power. This paradox set the stage for Kharkov, a battle that would demonstrate the capacity of a defeated army to exploit the overconfidence of its adversary, and where experience, discipline, and timing could temporarily reverse the tide of a war that, in the larger sense, was increasingly turning against Germany. In the weeks following the surrender of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht faced a profound crisis of identity and capability. Losses in manpower, equipment, and morale were staggering, yet the German High Command was determined to maintain cohesion on the Eastern Front. Units that had escaped encirclement were rapidly reinforced, merged with other depleted formations, and restructured into mobile and semi-independent task forces capable of executing rapid strikes. This restructuring was not merely bureaucratic. It represented a calculated effort to retain tactical flexibility despite strategic setbacks. Experienced officers who survived the carnage of Stalingrad became invaluable. Their insight into Soviet methods and their hard-earned understanding of winter operations shaping the planning for the counteroffensive that would culminate at Kharkov. The human dimension of the post-Stalingrad Wehrmacht was particularly striking. Soldiers carried the psychological weight of defeat, yet simultaneously possessed a hardened resilience born of survival under the harshest conditions imaginable. They had endured the encirclement, witnessed the suffering of comrades, and faced the relentless onslaught of Soviet artillery in winter weather. These experiences, while traumatizing, also fostered an intimate understanding of both the enemy and the terrain, granting German commanders insights that could be leveraged in the upcoming operations. The interplay between exhaustion, tactical knowledge, and disciplined execution created a uniquely dangerous force, a battered army, yes, but one capable of extraordinary operational feats. Manstein's operational philosophy became a central pillar of German recovery. He recognized that victory would not come from head-on engagements, but through the judicious application of mobile warfare, deception, and concentrated counterattacks. He meticulously analyzed the patterns of Soviet advances, identifying points of overextension and logistical vulnerability. The frozen terrain, often seen as a hindrance, became a strategic asset. Frozen rivers allowed armored units to bypass natural obstacles, while snow-covered forests concealed troop movements from aerial reconnaissance. Manstein's genius lay in synchronizing these environmental factors with the placement of elite units, artillery, and mechanized divisions, ensuring that when the moment of attack arrived, the impact would be both precise and devastating. The logistical undertakings required for this resurgence were immense. Fuel, ammunition, and food supplies had to be transported across devastated landscapes while avoiding Soviet interdiction. Mechanized units, tanks, and artillery pieces were repaired and refitted in makeshift workshops, often under bitterly cold conditions. Supply officers coordinated complex rail and road networks to ensure that striking forces could reach designated positions without delay. This intricate orchestration, often conducted under severe environmental stress, underscored the Wehrmacht's enduring operational sophistication despite recent calamities. It was a testament to the Army's adaptability and the strategic foresight of commanders like Manstein. For the Soviets, the aftermath of Stalingrad presented a double-edged sword. Victory instilled confidence, but also fostered overextension and complacency. The Red Army, flush with momentum, pushed deep into eastern Ukraine, capturing towns, rail junctions, and industrial centers with remarkable speed. However, the logistical and operational strain of such advances was significant. Supply convoys stretched across hundreds of kilometers, rail lines were vulnerable to sabotage, and coordination among disparate army groups sometimes faltered. Soviet commanders were acutely aware of these challenges, but were under immense pressure to sustain offensive operations and capitalize on perceived German weakness. This delicate balance between ambition and logistical reality would play a critical role in the dynamics of the coming battle around Kharkov. Civilians in the region bore witness to the war's relentless churn. Kharkov's population had already endured multiple occupations, and its industrial landscape had suffered extensive damage. Families sought refuge amidst rubble, rationed scarce food supplies, and navigated the uncertainty of shifting front lines. The human cost of war intersected with military operations in profound ways. Soldiers relied on local knowledge for navigation and reconnaissance, and urban structures could serve as both defensive positions and traps. The intertwining of human endurance, urban destruction, and military necessity created a complex theater in which every decision resonated across multiple layers of consequence that in the cities, forests, and open plains surrounding Kharkov. The stage was being meticulously prepared. German reconnaissance probed Soviet lines, gathering intelligence on troop dispositions, supply routes, and command structures. Soviet scouts, equally diligent, attempted to anticipate German reactions, but the fluidity of the front and the dispersed nature of forces limited the accuracy of their reports. In this intricate interplay of observation and deception, the Wehrmacht's surviving strength began to emerge as a latent force capable of achieving remarkable tactical results. Manstein's vision was slowly crystallizing into a coordinated plan of action, where the integration of intelligence, mobility, and timing would define the outcome. As February progressed, the Wehrmacht's position evolved from defensive posturing to a poised readiness for counteroffensive action. Units were positioned strategically, reserves held in depth, and lines of communication reinforced. The army had absorbed the lessons of Stalingrad. Overextension was dangerous, coordination was vital, and the enemy's confidence could be exploited. This preparation transformed the battered Wehrmacht into a disciplined and formidable fighting force, one capable of striking back decisively when the conditions were optimal. The contrast between the perceived vulnerability of Germany after Stalingrad and the latent operational strength embodied by Manstein's forces created a tension that would define the Third Battle of Kharkov. The aftermath of Stalingrad, therefore, was not merely a period of retreat and recovery. It was a crucible in which the Wehrmacht's resilience, adaptability, and tactical ingenuity were tested and reaffirmed. It set the conditions for one of the most striking counteroffensives of the Eastern Front, where strategy, human endurance, and the harsh winter environment converged. In Kharkov, the remnants of a shattered army would demonstrate that even in defeat, careful planning, leadership, and disciplined execution could produce a temporary yet remarkable resurgence, one that would momentarily challenge the momentum of the seemingly unstoppable Red Army. Chapter 3: Manstein's Dilemma. Strategy amid collapse. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein faced one of the most complex dilemmas of his military career in early 1943. The Wehrmacht had suffered immense losses at Stalingrad, leaving vast gaps in its front lines and a morale crisis that threatened to paralyze the German effort on the Eastern Front. Yet Manstein, a master of operational art, refused to concede to despair. He recognized that the shattered remnants of the German army still contained opportunities for decisive action. His challenge was to reconcile the stark reality of depletion with the audacity required to achieve strategic objectives. This delicate balancing act would define the planning and execution of the Third Battle of Kharkov, a confrontation that demanded precision, timing, and the ability to exploit even the smallest Soviet miscalculations. The dilemma Manstein faced was multifaceted. On one hand, the Red Army was advancing rapidly into eastern Ukraine, buoyed by the psychological high of Stalingrad and eager to consolidate its gains. Soviet forces had achieved remarkable operational depth, pushing through towns and rail lines and liberating key cities. Their confidence, while understandable, often led to overextension, creating vulnerabilities in supply chains and gaps in their front lines. On the other hand, the Wehrmacht was weakened, its armored units under strength, its infantry exhausted, and its logistics stretched thin. Any offensive operation required precise coordination, the rapid concentration of forces, and the careful management of reserves to avoid disaster. Manstein had to reconcile the need for bold action with the limitations imposed by his depleted forces. Central to Manstein's dilemma was the question of initiative. The conventional military wisdom of the time suggested that a weakened force should adopt defensive positions, trading space for time while rebuilding strength. However, Manstein's genius lay in his understanding that passive defense in this context could be fatal. The Soviets were not only advancing but also learning from their operational successes, improving coordination, and expanding their mechanized capabilities. By ceding initiative entirely, the Wehrmacht risked losing Kharkov without a fight, allowing Soviet forces to consolidate in favorable positions. Manstein's solution was counterintuitive yet elegant. Strike decisively at the overextended Soviet units before they could entrench, using mobility, concentrated armor, and well-timed infantry assaults to regain the operational initiative. The terrain around Kharkov added further complexity to Manstein's calculations. Open plains, forests, rivers, and urban centers all posed both opportunities and hazards. Frozen rivers could facilitate armored movement, but could also become death traps if targeted by artillery or airstrikes. Forested areas provided cover for infiltration and concealment, but dense woods limited the maneuverability of tanks and artillery. Urban areas, particularly Kharkov itself, offered defensive advantages but demanded intensive manpower to secure each street and building. Understanding the interplay between these geographic factors and the disposition of enemy forces was critical to developing a viable operational plan. Manstein had to account for the strengths and weaknesses of both his own units and those of the Soviets, integrating environmental conditions into every stage of his strategy. That Manstein's intelligence assessments played a pivotal role in shaping his approach. German reconnaissance units, signals intelligence, and aerial observation provided fragmented but valuable insights into Soviet troop movements and logistical patterns. Reports indicated that Soviet armored formations were advancing rapidly, but often without adequate infantry support, while supply lines were stretched thin across snow-covered roads and damaged railways. Manstein realized that if he could identify weak points, concentrate his forces, and strike with speed, he could achieve encirclement or, at the very least, force the Soviets to withdraw under pressure. This understanding required patience and careful timing, as premature attacks could result in catastrophic losses. The balance between boldness and caution defined the operational philosophy underpinning the upcoming battle. The human dimension of Manstein's dilemma cannot be overstated. Commanders and soldiers alike were acutely aware of the stakes. The morale of troops recovering from Stalingrad was fragile, and any misstep could erode confidence irreparably. Manstein had to inspire his officers and men, conveying a clear vision of the objectives while instilling discipline to execute complex maneuvers under the stress of extreme winter conditions. The coordination required for combined arms operations, infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, demanded trust in subordinate commanders, precise timing, and rapid adaptability to unforeseen circumstances. In essence, the success of the operation depended not only on strategic genius, but on the ability to translate strategy into effective action under the harshest conditions. Resource management formed another layer of Manstein's challenge. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, and fuel were finite, and each expenditure had to be calculated for maximum effect. The winter environment complicated logistics further. Vehicles frequently broke down in sub-zero temperatures, roads became impassable with thawing snow, and supply convoys risked ambush by Soviet partisans or reconnaissance units. The careful allocation of reserves, both mechanized and infantry, was essential to sustain momentum during the planned counteroffensive. Every decision carried risk. Overcommitment could lead to encirclement. Undercommitment could allow the Soviets to consolidate their gains. The art of balancing force application under severe constraints became the essence of Manstein's dilemma. Finally, the psychological aspect of the operation weighed heavily on Manstein. The Wehrmacht's reputation had been tarnished by the disaster at Stalingrad, and a failure at Kharkov could have disastrous strategic and morale consequences, both within Germany and on the Eastern Front. Conversely, a successful counterattack could restore credibility, stabilize the southern sector, and temporarily halt Soviet advances. Manstein's decision-making was therefore guided not only by tactical and operational considerations, but by the awareness that the symbolic value of success was almost as important as its military impact. Each maneuver, each calculated risk, was imbued with the knowledge that the outcome would resonate far beyond the immediate battlefield. As February 1943 progressed, Manstein's focus sharpened on the timing and sequencing of his operations around Kharkov. He understood that speed and surprise would be decisive, particularly when facing a numerically superior Red Army buoyed by recent successes. The core of his strategy rested on exploiting Soviet overextension, using a combination of maneuver warfare, concentrated firepower, and deceptive positioning. Rather than engaging in static defense, he envisioned a dynamic counteroffensive that could disrupt the Soviets' momentum, inflict significant casualties, and regain control of key terrain. Each element of this plan had to be executed with precision, as any delay or miscalculation could result in catastrophic losses, undoing the painstaking efforts to rebuild the Wehrmacht after Stalingrad. The German forces under Manstein were, by necessity, a patchwork of veteran formations and newly replenished units. The SS Panzer Corps, comprising experienced armored divisions, formed the spearhead of the anticipated counterattack. These elite units, battle-hardened and well-equipped, were complemented by infantry divisions that, while less experienced, were tasked with supporting roles and securing flanks. Artillery, meticulously positioned, provided the firepower necessary to disrupt Soviet positions and cover advances. Air support, though limited in scale compared to total operational demands, offered reconnaissance and tactical strikes against concentrated Soviet formations. The orchestration of these elements required careful coordination, synchronized movement, and contingency planning to adapt to the fluid battlefield that Manstein's dilemma extended beyond military considerations to logistical challenges. The harsh winter environment posed constant threats to mobility and sustainability. Frozen roads and snow-covered plains facilitated tank movements in some areas, while in others, mud, damaged infrastructure, and the risk of vehicle immobilization created potential vulnerabilities. Fuel supplies were precious, and every kilometer traversed consumed not only resources but strategic flexibility. Ammunition stockpiles had to be carefully allocated to ensure that decisive strikes could be executed without interruption. The careful calibration of logistics and operations transformed what might have seemed an insurmountable challenge into a calculated risk with a real prospect of success. Intelligence and reconnaissance became critical components in resolving Manstein's dilemma. German units conducted extensive aerial and ground reconnaissance, mapping Soviet positions, monitoring troop movements, and identifying potential weak points in the Red Army's deployments. Soviet forces, advancing rapidly, often left gaps between units and stretched their supply lines to dangerous lengths. Manstein recognized that if he could time his offensive to strike these vulnerable points, he could achieve encirclement and force withdrawals that would stabilize the front. The interplay between intelligence, operational timing, and tactical execution was a defining feature of the forthcoming battle, illustrating the complexity of modern mechanized warfare on the Eastern Front. Manstein's psychological management of his troops was equally critical. Soldiers had endured the demoralization of Stalingrad, and many carried the scars of both physical hardship and psychological trauma. Inspiring confidence required not only clear communication of objectives, but the demonstration of competence and foresight. Manstein's leadership instilled the understanding that every unit, from armored divisions to infantry regiments, played an integral role in a coordinated maneuver designed to exploit enemy weaknesses. The clarity of purpose, coupled with meticulous planning, allowed German troops to prepare mentally for the challenges of winter combat, urban fighting, and mobile operations, fostering cohesion and resilience in the face of adversity. The Soviets, in contrast, operated under the weight of both opportunity and expectation. Their rapid advances had created logistical bottlenecks and occasional gaps in defensive cohesion. While their numerical superiority was unquestionable, their forces were sometimes spread thin, and inexperienced units were intermingled with veterans in a manner that created vulnerabilities. Manstein's strategy relied on identifying these weak points and applying concentrated force to create disruption, confusion, and localized superiority. The German counteroffensive would rely less on the quantity of troops and more on the quality of deployment, timing, and exploitation of enemy mistakes, demonstrating the enduring principle that tactical acumen can compensate for numerical inferiority. Another critical aspect of the dilemma was the timing of engagement relative to the weather. Winter, while harsh, offered advantages that could be exploited by the Wehrmacht. Frozen rivers facilitated unexpected crossings for tanks and infantry, while snow and mist could obscure movements from Soviet reconnaissance. However, the same conditions posed severe risks. Vehicles could become immobilized, artillery crews were exposed to freezing temperatures, and soldiers faced the constant threat of frostbite and hypothermia. Manstein's calculations incorporated both the opportunities and hazards of the winter environment, ensuring that operational tempo and timing were optimized to leverage natural conditions while minimizing exposure to risk. Ultimately, Manstein's dilemma was resolved through a combination of foresight, patience, and operational audacity. He recognized that success required synchronizing multiple variables: unit cohesion, intelligence, timing, terrain, and psychological factors. By carefully positioning his forces, conserving resources, and preparing to strike at the precise moment, he transformed a situation of apparent weakness into an opportunity for tactical brilliance. The Third Battle of Kharkov would not merely be a fight over a city. It would be a demonstration of the enduring potency of operational art, where strategy, environment, and human resilience converge to shape the outcome. In this way, Manstein's dilemma highlights the intersection of adversity and opportunity on the Eastern Front. It illustrates how a commander, faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, can employ intelligence, discipline, and audacity to create conditions for success. The lessons of this period resonate far beyond the immediate battle. They underscore the importance of timing, flexibility, and the integration of multiple operational dimensions in complex warfare. The stage was set, the forces poised, and the frozen landscape of Kharkov awaited the clash that would become Germany's last great victory on the Eastern Front. Chapter 4. Soviet Ambitions. The Red Army's drive into Ukraine. The Soviet advance into eastern Ukraine in early 1943 was marked by both exhilaration and overconfidence. Following the catastrophic defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the Red Army seized the initiative, pushing westward with remarkable speed. The liberation of towns and cities across the Donetsk Basin, combined with the capture of critical rail hubs, created a sense of unstoppable momentum. Commanders at every level believed that the Wehrmacht had been irreparably weakened and that further advances into Ukraine could yield strategic depth, securing the southern flank of the Soviet front and paving the way toward the Dnieper River. Yet this ambitious drive carried inherent risks, as speed often outpaced logistical support, and operational planning sometimes struggled to keep pace with the rapid territorial gains. The Red Army's ambitions were fueled by a combination of strategic necessity and political imperatives. Moscow and the Soviet High Command demanded results that would consolidate the victory at Stalingrad and demonstrate the inevitability of German defeat. Rapid advances into eastern Ukraine were not simply about territorial control, but about maintaining morale, reinforcing the narrative of liberation, and projecting the strength of the Soviet state. The political dimension of military operations added pressure on commanders to act decisively, often encouraging aggressive maneuvers that stretched supply lines, risked exposure of vulnerable units, and created opportunities for a competent opponent to exploit in operational terms. The Red Army relied on a mix of mechanized formations, infantry, and artillery, coordinated across multiple fronts. Armored units spearheaded advances, seeking to break through weakened German positions, while infantry and artillery provided support and consolidation. However, coordination across this massive force presented substantial challenges. Communication lines were often strained, orders from higher command delayed, and the integration of newly formed units introduced inconsistencies in performance and experience. While the Soviets held numerical superiority, the dispersed nature of their forces sometimes resulted in uneven strength along critical sectors of the front, creating vulnerabilities that a skilled adversary could exploit. Logistics emerged as a critical limiting factor in the Soviet drive. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies had to traverse vast distances over war-damaged railways and roads. Harsh winter conditions further complicated transportation. Snow and ice impeded movement. Frozen rivers both facilitated and obstructed crossings, and mud from thawing snow created mobility challenges for both vehicles and infantry. These logistical pressures imposed subtle but significant constraints on operational tempo. While Soviet commanders pushed for rapid advances, each kilometer of progress increased the strain on supply lines, forcing critical decisions about where to concentrate forces and how to manage reserves effectively. The human element of the Red Army's advance also shaped operational realities. Soldiers were driven by both ideology and a desire for revenge against an enemy that had inflicted immense suffering on the Soviet population. Morale was high following Stalingrad, yet the rapid pace of operations often led to fatigue, supply shortages, and exposure to extreme winter conditions. Commanders had to balance the need for relentless pressure on German positions with the physical limits of their troops, a challenge compounded by the scale of operations and the varying experience levels of units involved. The intersection of human endurance and operational ambition created a dynamic tension that influenced both strategy and tactics. Soviet planners recognized the strategic importance of Kharkov early in the campaign. The city's industrial base, transportation infrastructure, and position near the Donets River made it a critical objective. Capturing Kharkov promised to secure the southern flank, enable further penetration into Ukraine, and disrupt remaining German operational capabilities in the region. Yet the very ambition to seize Kharkov rapidly introduced risks: overextension of forces, insufficient reconnaissance, and the challenge of coordinating disparate units over a sprawling and often devastated landscape. Each of these factors would later play a crucial role in shaping the dynamics of the Third Battle of Kharkov. In addition to military considerations, the Soviets also contended with environmental factors. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was brutal, with sub-zero temperatures, snowstorms, and rapidly changing conditions that affected both personnel and equipment. Armored units, while formidable on paper, often struggled with mechanical failures and limited mobility in these conditions. Infantry movements were slowed by deep snow, frozen rivers, and devastated terrain. Artillery and supply units faced delays in delivering critical support to frontline formations. These environmental challenges, combined with the operational demands of rapid advances, required careful planning and adaptability, qualities that were sometimes inconsistent across the vast Soviet formations. Despite these challenges, Soviet ambitions remained relentless. The High Command expected the Red Army to press forward, liberate key urban centers, and exploit the perceived weakness of the German army. Confidence, however, carried a double-edged sword. It encouraged bold maneuvers but risked exposing units to counterattack. Manstein and the remnants of the Wehrmacht were acutely aware of these dynamics. They watched the Soviet advance carefully, identifying gaps, overextended units, and vulnerable flanks. The interplay between Soviet ambition and German cunning would soon define the course of operations around Kharkov, demonstrating the precarious balance between momentum and vulnerability on the Eastern Front. The advance into Ukraine, while strategically promising, revealed the paradox of Soviet strength. Numerical superiority and recent victories fostered an aggressive approach, yet these same factors created the conditions for potential disaster. Extended supply lines, dispersed formations, and varying levels of troop experience made the Red Army susceptible to concentrated counterattacks, particularly by a force as skilled and adaptive as Manstein's. The frozen landscape of eastern Ukraine, with its combination of urban centers, open plains, and forested areas, amplified both opportunities and risks, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes of maneuver warfare in World War II. As the Red Army pressed deeper into eastern Ukraine, their operational momentum began to stretch thin, revealing the fine line between audacity and vulnerability. The speed of their advance, fueled by recent triumphs at Stalingrad, created an illusion of invincibility that masked growing logistical and tactical challenges. Supply lines became overextended, moving fuel, ammunition, and provisions across hundreds of kilometers of war-torn terrain. Railways, bridges, and roads damaged by retreating German forces or partisan activity complicated transportation. Armored divisions, while powerful, often moved faster than supporting infantry or artillery, creating gaps that could be exploited by an alert enemy. The rapid advance, while psychologically empowering, introduced systemic vulnerabilities that Manstein would later exploit with devastating effect. Soviet commanders, driven by both the expectations of the High Command and their own sense of strategic opportunity pushed units aggressively toward Kharkov. The city represented not only a tactical objective, but also a symbolic prize, whose capture would mark a continuation of the narrative of unstoppable Soviet victory. This pressure to achieve visible, rapid results sometimes overshadowed operational prudence. Reconnaissance was occasionally neglected, coordination between adjacent formations was inconsistent, and overconfidence led to deployment of units in positions that were vulnerable to counterattack. While the Red Army had numerical superiority, its dispersion across multiple axes of advance meant that isolated units could face concentrated German firepower if attacked at the right moment. The human cost of the Soviet drive into Ukraine was significant. Soldiers endured bitter cold, frostbite, hunger, and fatigue, all while maintaining a forward momentum that demanded relentless physical and mental effort. New recruits, often poorly trained and inexperienced, were thrust into highly complex mechanized operations alongside veterans of previous campaigns. The stress on commanders at every level was immense, as they attempted to balance operational objectives, troop welfare, and tactical realities. The harsh winter environment amplified these pressures, making even simple movements dangerous and complicating coordination of infantry, armor, and artillery units across fractured landscapes. Soviet strategy also relied heavily on the principle of encirclement, seeking to envelop German units and cut off retreat routes. While this approach had succeeded spectacularly at Stalingrad, the conditions in Ukraine presented different challenges. German forces, though weakened, had reorganized and were prepared to absorb attacks, retreat when necessary, and launch counteroffensives at critical junctures. The reliance on rapid encirclement exposed Soviet units to the possibility of counter-encirclement, particularly in urban areas or along key transportation nodes such as railways and bridges. Manstein, aware of these vulnerabilities, meticulously planned the timing and coordination of his counterattack to exploit Soviet overextension. Kharkov itself, a city already scarred by repeated occupations and previous battles, became both a magnet and a trap. Soviet forces occupied the outskirts and key industrial districts, often focusing on symbolic gains while logistical and defensive considerations lagged behind. German units, concealed in forests, towns, and along riverbanks, prepared for concentrated strikes designed to destabilize Soviet positions. The interplay between urban complexity, environmental conditions, and the disposition of forces created a highly dynamic battlefield where initiative and timing would determine outcomes. The city was no longer simply a strategic objective. It was a testing ground for the operational art of maneuver, encirclement, and counterattack. Manstein's anticipation of Soviet overreach illustrates the subtlety of operational warfare. By analyzing patterns of movement, identifying weakly held positions, and considering the limitations imposed by terrain and weather, he positioned his units to strike where the Soviets were most vulnerable. The result would be a series of engagements that demonstrated the effectiveness of concentrated, rapid counterattacks against a numerically superior force. This approach highlighted the contrast between Soviet ambition and German operational precision, setting the stage for the dramatic reversals that would define the Third Battle of Kharkov. The advance into Ukraine also exposed the Red Army to the brutal realities of winter combat. Tanks immobilized by frozen terrain, infantry slowed by deep snow, and artillery delayed by logistical obstacles created operational friction that hampered the Soviets' ability to consolidate gains. Manstein, capitalizing on these conditions, planned to introduce mobile armored units at decisive points, striking vulnerable flanks and isolated formations. The frozen landscape, initially an obstacle, became an instrument in German hands, demonstrating the profound influence of environmental conditions on the dynamics of mechanized warfare. Psychologically, the Red Army's push created a sense of inevitable victory that, while motivating, also increased the risk of misjudgment. Confidence bred aggression, and in complex winter operations, aggression without careful reconnaissance and coordination could lead to devastating consequences. The Soviets were advancing quickly but often into spaces where supply, cohesion, and situational awareness were compromised. This scenario would provide the Wehrmacht with the precise conditions necessary to orchestrate a counteroffensive that could inflict significant casualties, regain critical terrain, and temporarily halt Soviet momentum. By late February 1943, the stage was set for a confrontation that would combine operational brilliance with human endurance, environmental challenges, and tactical precision. The Red Army's ambitious drive into Ukraine had brought them to the doorstep of Kharkov, but it had also created vulnerabilities that a skillful adversary could exploit. The tension between Soviet ambition and logistical reality, between momentum and overextension, defined the conditions of battle. Kharkov would become the crucible where strategy, timing, and resilience collided, producing outcomes that would resonate across the Eastern Front and demonstrate the enduring complexity of war. Chapter 5. The Third Battle of Kharkov begins. A city in flames. As February 1943 drew to a close, the stage for the Third Battle of Kharkov was fully set. The city, already scarred from previous occupations and battles, became the focal point of an epic confrontation on the Eastern Front. Both the German Wehrmacht and the advancing Red Army recognized the strategic, industrial, and symbolic importance of Kharkov. For the Soviets, it represented the continuation of momentum after Stalingrad, a tangible marker of their ascendancy. For the Germans, it was a chance for redemption, an opportunity to reclaim initiative and demonstrate that the Wehrmacht, though battered, remained a force capable of executing complex maneuvers under extreme conditions. The frozen landscape surrounding the city, punctuated by bombed-out factories, rail lines, and open plains, provided a stage where strategy, timing, and human endurance would intertwine with devastating effect. The first movements of the German counteroffensive were subtle but meticulously planned. Units were repositioned under the cover of forests, snowdrifts, and abandoned villages, their presence carefully concealed from Soviet observation. Reconnaissance teams gathered intelligence on troop placements, supply routes, and weak points along the Soviet lines. Artillery batteries were placed in hidden positions, capable of delivering concentrated fire at critical moments. Mechanized divisions, including elements of the elite SS Panzer Corps, were strategically placed to strike where the enemy was most vulnerable. This orchestration was not merely about physical positioning. It was about shaping the battlefield itself, manipulating the enemy's perception of strength and opportunity, and creating conditions for a decisive blow. Soviet forces, flush with confidence from their advances into eastern Ukraine, had fortified positions around Kharkov but were stretched thin. Armored units often operated ahead of supporting infantry. Supply lines extended across hundreds of kilometers, and coordination between fronts was occasionally fragmented. While the Soviets held numerical superiority, these advantages were offset by dispersion and logistical vulnerability. The city's outskirts, industrial zones, and transportation hubs became focal points for both preparation and tension, as commanders weighed the benefits of holding ground against the risks of overextension. Soldiers in these forward positions faced the dual pressures of maintaining offensive momentum and preparing to repel the inevitable German counterattacks. Urban warfare loomed as a critical component of the coming battle. Kharkov streets, lined with bombed-out buildings and industrial facilities, provided both cover and hazards for advancing forces. Control of intersections, rail yards, and factories could determine the outcome of localized engagements, and every building became a potential stronghold or trap. German commanders anticipated that the Soviets might rely on static defensive measures, creating opportunities for mobile, coordinated strikes that could bypass or overwhelm fortified positions. Infantry units, supported by armor and artillery, would need to execute rapid maneuvers with precision to exploit weaknesses and avoid entrapment. The complexity of urban combat added another layer of challenge to an already high-stakes confrontation. The psychological dimension of the battle was equally significant. German soldiers, many of whom had endured the trauma of Stalingrad, were aware that their actions could restore morale and legitimacy to the beleaguered Wehrmacht. The anticipation of striking back, of seizing the initiative from a confident but overextended enemy, provided motivation despite exhaustion and adverse conditions. For the Soviets, the rapid advance into Kharkov had fostered a sense of invincibility. Confidence, while initially empowering, created vulnerabilities. Troops sometimes advanced without sufficient reconnaissance. Command structures struggled to keep pace with fast-moving units, and overextension created opportunities for encirclement. The clash of these psychological states, determination and cautious patience on one side, confidence and overreach on the other, would shape the course of the battle. Weather and terrain played a central role in the opening phase of operations. Winter conditions in eastern Ukraine imposed unique challenges on both sides. Frozen rivers allowed armored units to maneuver in unexpected directions, while snow and mist obscured movements and hampered reconnaissance. Conversely, thawing snow and muddy roads could immobilize vehicles and delay reinforcements. Commanders had to account for these environmental variables when planning attacks, positioning artillery, and coordinating logistics. The terrain became an active participant in the battle, influencing the speed of advances, the success of defensive measures, and the timing of counterattacks. Understanding and exploiting these conditions would be critical for both sides. The Manstein's initial strategy relied on drawing the Soviets further into overextended positions around Kharkov, creating pockets of vulnerability that could be exploited through rapid, concentrated strikes. Mechanized units, poised in hidden sectors, were ready to encircle isolated Soviet divisions, while artillery and infantry prepared to engage in both urban and open-field combat. The emphasis was on operational flexibility. Units were tasked with adapting to enemy movements, seizing initiative locally, and exploiting opportunities as they arose. This approach required discipline, coordination, and an acute awareness of both the enemy's and the environment's dynamic nature. As the first engagements erupted around Kharkov's outskirts, the city appeared to be a place suspended between devastation and imminent conflict. Artillery fire echoed across open plains, armored units maneuvered cautiously through snow-laden roads, and infantry braced for the intensity of urban combat. Both sides understood that control of Kharkov would not be achieved through attrition alone. Success required maneuver, surprise, and the capacity to anticipate and respond to enemy actions. The battle's opening days set a tone of uncertainty, tension, and dramatic fluidity, highlighting the interplay between strategy, environmental conditions, and human endurance that would define the entire campaign. The Third Battle of Kharkov, in its initial phase, exemplified the complexity of warfare on the Eastern Front. Both the German Wehrmacht and the Red Army faced the same unforgiving conditions, yet their approaches diverged based on experience, leadership, and operational philosophy. The Germans, under Manstein, emphasized patience, deception, and the judicious application of force. The Soviets, driven by momentum and ambition, sought to capitalize on perceived weakness. The collision of these approaches, combined with the harsh winter environment, urban complexity, and extended supply lines, created a scenario where strategic brilliance could decisively influence outcomes. Kharkov was not merely a city. It was a crucible in which the principles of maneuver warfare, resilience, and timing would be tested to the utmost. As the German counteroffensive around Kharkov gathered momentum, the dynamics of the battlefield became increasingly complex and perilous. Soviet forces, initially confident in their rapid advances, began to encounter resistance carefully orchestrated by Manstein's forces. Mechanized units emerged from concealed positions, executing flanking maneuvers designed to cut off overextended Soviet divisions. Artillery concentrations targeted supply routes and key defensive positions, disrupting communications and creating confusion. Infantry, moving with precision, secured critical points within the urban landscape, turning the ruins of Kharkov into a dynamic and perilous battlefield. The combination of timing, coordination, and environmental awareness transformed the city into a stage where strategic calculation could decisively shift the balance of power. The Red Army, despite its numerical superiority, faced a dilemma. Units that had advanced rapidly were now exposed along extended fronts, with flanks vulnerable to encirclement. Communication between divisions became sporadic, and the high tempo of operations strained logistical support. Ammunition shortages, fuel constraints, and the exhaustion of troops compounded operational difficulties. In these conditions, the German counteroffensive exploited the precise weaknesses created by the Soviet advance, demonstrating how operational overreach can transform apparent strength into critical vulnerability. The interplay between ambition and caution, between forward momentum and tactical prudence, defined the evolving narrative of the battle. Urban combat in Kharkov intensified as German forces penetrated the outskirts and industrial districts. Streets, factories, and rail yards became sites of fierce engagements. Snipers, machine gun nests, and improvised barricades slowed advances, while tanks and artillery were employed to break through fortified positions. The Germans emphasized mobility and coordination, using combined arms to overwhelm isolated Soviet units. This approach contrasted with Soviet tactics, which relied on holding ground and utilizing numerical superiority to maintain control. The dense urban environment amplified the consequences of every maneuver, where a single misstep could lead to encirclement, casualties, or loss of critical positions. The Manstein's tactical genius became increasingly apparent in this phase. By exploiting gaps between Soviet units and targeting overextended divisions, he created localized pockets of superiority despite overall numerical inferiority. Rapid armored thrusts aimed to encircle and isolate Soviet formations, while infantry and artillery maintained pressure on defensive positions. The timing of these attacks was critical. Strikes had to be coordinated across multiple axes to prevent the Soviets from consolidating or retreating effectively. This operational precision underscored the importance of leadership, discipline, and planning in achieving success against a numerically superior adversary. The environmental conditions continued to play a significant role. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures influenced movement, visibility, and operational endurance. Roads, while frozen, allowed rapid armored maneuvers in certain sectors, yet thawing or muddy terrain elsewhere slowed troop movements and created vulnerabilities. Winter conditions affected both personnel and equipment, imposing additional physical and mechanical challenges. Soldiers contended with frostbite, exhaustion, and the constant threat of exposure, while vehicle crews managed engines, tracks, and artillery under extreme cold. Mastery of these environmental factors became as important as strategy or firepower, shaping both the pace and outcomes of engagements. Psychologically, the battle placed immense pressure on both sides. German troops, motivated by the opportunity to reclaim initiative and restore morale after Stalingrad, displayed determination and cohesion under difficult conditions. The clarity of Manstein's objectives and the precision of his planning instilled confidence in units executing complex maneuvers. Soviet soldiers, initially buoyed by the successes of their advance, now faced the shock of concentrated, coordinated counterattacks. Confusion, disruption, and the sudden realization of vulnerability eroded confidence, demonstrating how psychological factors can amplify the impact of tactical operations. The Third Battle of Kharkov in this early phase revealed the intricate interplay between mobility, deception, and timing. The Germans relied on flexible deployment, rapid armored strikes, and the exploitation of overextended Soviet positions. The Soviets relied on momentum, numerical strength, and fortified positions, yet their dispersion and stretched logistics created exploitable weaknesses. Every engagement, from open field clashes to urban street fighting, demonstrated how operational art and tactical ingenuity could influence outcomes even under extreme environmental and logistical constraints. By mid-March 1943, German forces had begun to consolidate gains around key sectors of Kharkov. Soviet units, though resilient, were increasingly forced into defensive postures, reacting to the pace and precision of German counterattacks. The city itself became a contested terrain, with streets, factories, and rail lines changing hands multiple times. The ebb and flow of combat illustrated the dynamic nature of the battlefield, where initiative, timing, and coordination determined success more than sheer numbers. The interplay between human endurance, environmental conditions, and operational strategy defined this stage of the battle, creating a crucible in which the Wehrmacht's remaining strengths were tested to the fullest. The early days of the Third Battle of Kharkov thus exemplified the convergence of strategy, human resilience, and environmental mastery. Manstein's forces, recovering from the debacle of Stalingrad, demonstrated that even a weakened army could exploit the overconfidence of an opponent, execute complex maneuvers, and regain the initiative. Soviet ambitions, while impressive, were tempered by the realities of logistics, terrain, and coordination. The clash of these forces set the tone for one of Germany's last major victories on the Eastern Front, a battle defined not merely by territorial gains, but by the execution of operational art under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Chapter 6: Encirclement and Counterattack. German Precision Strikes. The Third Battle of Kharkov reached a critical juncture as the German counteroffensive transitioned from careful positioning to decisive action. Manstein's forces, having studied Soviet dispositions and exploited their overextended supply lines, launched precision strikes designed to encircle and destabilize isolated Red Army units. The principle was deceptively simple: identify vulnerabilities, concentrate firepower, and strike swiftly. Yet in practice, this required extraordinary coordination, timing, and discipline, particularly given the winter conditions, urban complexities, and the psychological scars lingering from Stalingrad. The encirclement and counterattack phase would showcase the Wehrmacht's operational ingenuity and the stark consequences of overextension on the Soviet side. German mechanized formations spearheaded the counterattack, moving with calculated speed through snow-covered roads and frozen terrain. Tanks, often concealed until the moment of attack, struck at flanks and weakly defended positions, creating confusion among Soviet units. Infantry divisions advanced in coordination with armor, securing critical junctions, rail lines, and urban peripheries to prevent escape or reinforcement. Artillery concentrations, positioned in concealed locations, delivered sudden, overwhelming barrages that shattered Soviet defenses and disrupted communications. The orchestration of these movements demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of combined arms operations, where each element complemented the others, amplifying both destructive power and psychological impact. The Soviets, initially caught off guard, were forced into rapid defensive actions. Units that had advanced confidently now found themselves encircled or under threat of envelopment. Communications were fragmented, orders delayed, and attempts to coordinate countermeasures often failed due to the speed and precision of German attacks. Supply lines, already stretched across hundreds of kilometers, became liabilities as advancing units could not be resupplied in time to sustain combat effectiveness. The encirclement strategy, carefully timed and executed, leveraged not just the Wehrmacht's operational strengths, but also the inherent vulnerabilities created by the Red Army's rapid advance. Urban and industrial areas around Kharkov became focal points for these engagements. Streets, factories, and rail yards were transformed into deadly corridors of combat. German infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, moved with tactical discipline, isolating pockets of Soviet resistance and systematically reducing them. The Soviets, while tenacious, often found themselves defending fragmented positions without adequate support. The combination of mobility, surprise, and concentrated firepower allowed German units to achieve localized superiority, neutralizing Soviet advantages in numbers and creating conditions for further exploitation. Environmental factors continued to shape the course of the counteroffensive. Frozen rivers facilitated unexpected maneuver routes for German armored units, while snow-covered forests concealed troop movements. Conversely, mud and thawing snow impeded mobility in certain sectors, necessitating flexible operational adjustments. Winter conditions affected both sides equally, but the Germans' prior experience, meticulous planning, and disciplined execution allowed them to leverage environmental challenges as tactical advantages. The careful integration of terrain and weather into operational planning exemplified the sophisticated level of German military thinking at this stage of the war. The human dimension of the encirclement was profound. German troops, many of whom had endured the hardships of Stalingrad, approached the counterattack with a mixture of determination and learned caution. The psychological impact of reclaiming initiative was immense, boosting morale and reinforcing unit cohesion. Soviet soldiers, despite prior successes, faced disorientation, fear, and fatigue as German forces executed maneuvers with precision and speed. The stress of encirclement, combined with exposure to winter conditions, artillery bombardment, and the chaos of urban fighting, tested human endurance to its limits. The battle became not only a clash of armies but a crucible of human resilience and strategic acumen. Logistical precision underpinned the success of the German encirclement. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were coordinated to ensure that strikes maintained momentum. Mechanized units moved with support from infantry and artillery, while engineers cleared obstacles, repaired roads, and secured critical supply routes. This orchestration allowed the Germans to sustain offensive operations even under severe environmental and operational pressures. The ability to integrate logistics seamlessly into combat operations was a testament to the organizational sophistication that enabled the Wehrmacht to achieve temporary superiority despite recent losses. Soviet responses to the encirclement were varied. Some units attempted breakout maneuvers, often under heavy artillery and armored pressure, while others fell back into secondary defensive positions. The combination of speed, coordination, and operational foresight by the Germans made many of these attempts perilous. Overextended Soviet units frequently suffered severe casualties or were forced to surrender, illustrating the effectiveness of concentrated counterattacks against dispersed forces. The encirclement phase underscored a fundamental principle of warfare. Numerical advantage can be negated by superior operational execution, strategic positioning, and psychological pressure. Manstein's strategy during this phase exemplified the intersection of audacity and precision. By striking where the enemy was weakest, maintaining flexibility, and exploiting environmental conditions, German forces transformed the battlefield into a series of controlled engagements where initiative was retained and amplified. The success of the encirclement and counterattack highlighted how careful planning, timing, and adaptability could enable a weakened force to achieve decisive results against a numerically superior opponent. It was a stark demonstration of operational art under extreme conditions and a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the Wehrmacht in one of its final major victories on the Eastern Front. As the German counteroffensive intensified, the Red Army's overextended formations began to feel the full force of Manstein's operational acumen. The encirclement around Kharkov was executed with relentless precision, transforming dispersed Soviet units into isolated pockets of resistance. Mechanized divisions, spearheaded by tanks and motorized infantry, maneuvered with astonishing speed, striking vulnerable flanks and cutting off retreat routes. Artillery fire disrupted communications and supply lines, while infantry systematically secured key positions in urban and industrial areas. This combination of mobility, firepower, and coordination created the conditions for a dramatic reversal, shifting the balance of the battle and demonstrating the lethal effectiveness of concentrated, well-timed counterattacks. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was immediate and profound. Units that had previously advanced with confidence now faced uncertainty, confusion, and mounting pressure. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion across fractured formations, while soldiers contended with the physical and mental strain of being surrounded or attacked from multiple directions. Morale, once buoyed by the victories at Stalingrad and the rapid advance into Ukraine, began to waver under the relentless pressure of the German offensive. Encirclement, more than firepower alone, created a sense of inevitability, highlighting how operational strategy could exploit both material and psychological vulnerabilities simultaneously. Urban fighting intensified within Kharkov and its surrounding districts. German infantry, supported by armor and artillery, conducted methodical clearing operations in factories, rail yards, and residential districts. The Soviets, despite numerical superiority in some sectors, were forced to defend fragmented positions without adequate reinforcements. Each street and building became a microcosm of the larger operational struggle. Control of strategic intersections, supply depots, and industrial complexes could determine the success or failure of entire sectors. The urban environment magnified the consequences of every tactical decision, where a single breakthrough or misstep could cascade into broader operational shifts. The environmental conditions continued to influence combat operations in decisive ways. Snow and ice facilitated rapid armored maneuvers in open areas but hindered movement in others. Sub-zero temperatures affected both men and machinery, creating additional challenges for supply, mobility, and endurance. Despite these difficulties, German forces exploited environmental knowledge, using frozen rivers and obscured approaches to surprise Soviet positions. The careful integration of terrain and weather into operational planning exemplified how environmental mastery could amplify tactical and strategic advantages, turning the harsh winter landscape into a tool rather than an obstacle. Logistics remained a critical factor in sustaining the encirclement and counterattacks. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were coordinated meticulously to maintain operational tempo. Engineers cleared obstructions, repaired damaged roads, and ensured that mechanized formations could maneuver rapidly and sustain momentum. The German emphasis on logistical precision allowed offensive operations to continue without interruption, even under conditions that would have paralyzed less disciplined forces. This integration of logistics and combat execution under extreme environmental and operational pressures was central to the success of the encirclement. Soviet responses were increasingly desperate. Attempts at breakout were often met with concentrated artillery barrages and armored resistance, resulting in heavy casualties or forced surrenders. Units that could not retreat or regroup were systematically neutralized, reducing the overall effectiveness of the Soviet advance and consolidating German control over key sectors. These engagements highlighted the vulnerability inherent in rapid advances without adequate support and coordination, illustrating the operational maxim that overextension can transform apparent strength into strategic liability. Manstein's leadership throughout the encirclement phase demonstrated the synthesis of patience, audacity, and operational insight. By carefully observing Soviet movements, waiting for overextension, and striking with concentrated force at precisely the right moment, he turned a vulnerable Wehrmacht into a formidable operational engine. The interplay of timing, maneuver, environmental mastery, and coordination showcased the effectiveness of operational art in practice, proving that even a numerically inferior force could exploit intelligence, discipline, and tactical precision to achieve decisive results. By the end of the initial encirclement operations, German forces had effectively blunted the Soviet advance into Kharkov. Isolated Soviet divisions had been destroyed or forced into retreat, supply lines disrupted, and urban strongpoints seized. The counteroffensive demonstrated not only tactical brilliance, but also the broader strategic lesson that momentum alone could not guarantee victory, particularly when confronted by an adversary capable of exploiting environmental, logistical, and operational vulnerabilities. Kharkov, once threatened by overextension, now became the launching point for further German operations in the region. The encirclement and counterattack at Kharkov marked a defining moment on the Eastern Front. It was a testament to the resilience, ingenuity, and operational expertise of Manstein and his forces. It also underscored the perils of overextension, the importance of logistics and coordination, and the decisive impact of environmental conditions on combat operations. The battle would remain a striking example of how strategy, timing, and human endurance converge to shape the outcomes of war, and how even in moments of apparent weakness, skillful execution could produce one of Germany's last major victories on the Eastern Front. Chapter 7. The Turning Tide, Soviet Retreat and German Momentum. Following the initial German counterattacks and encirclement operations around Kharkov, the dynamics of the battlefield shifted dramatically. Soviet forces, once pressing forward with confidence, found themselves forced into a fighting retreat. The overextension that had initially provided momentum became a critical vulnerability. Units that had advanced quickly were now struggling to consolidate, with supply lines fragmented and coordination disrupted. Manstein's operational brilliance allowed the Germans to exploit these vulnerabilities, turning the initiative firmly back into their hands. The frozen plains and urban ruins of Kharkov became the stage for a series of engagements where precision, timing, and operational flexibility defined the course of the battle. The retreating Red Army faced immense logistical and operational challenges. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were difficult to distribute across extended and contested front lines. Armored units, while formidable, were often separated from supporting infantry, artillery, and reconnaissance elements, limiting their effectiveness in countering concentrated German strikes. Soviet commanders attempted to reorganize fragmented units, establish defensive lines, and protect key transportation routes. However, the speed and coordination of the German counteroffensive, coupled with the harsh winter environment, placed continual pressure on these efforts. Retreat became a tactical necessity rather than a strategic choice, and the Soviets had to contend with the increasing threat of encirclement as German forces pressed their advantage. Urban districts and industrial areas surrounding Kharkov played a crucial role during this phase. German infantry, backed by armor and artillery, advanced methodically, securing streets, factories, and railway junctions. Soviet defenders attempted to hold positions to slow the German momentum, creating localized pockets of intense combat. However, fragmented units, reduced morale, and disrupted communication channels undermined these efforts. German forces, utilizing both operational foresight and tactical precision, were able to turn urban terrain to their advantage, neutralizing resistance and opening corridors to encircle remaining Soviet units. The city itself, scarred by prior battles, became both a weapon and a battlefield, shaping the tempo and outcome of engagements. The momentum of the German advance was further reinforced by the psychological effects of the initial counterattacks. Soldiers, both German and Soviet, were acutely aware of the shifting tide. German units, recovering from the trauma of Stalingrad, were galvanized by the successful execution of encirclement operations and the restoration of operational initiative. Confidence, discipline, and clear objectives allowed them to act decisively in complex environments. Soviet soldiers, despite bravery and determination, were now forced to react under stress, uncertainty, and harsh environmental conditions. The psychological contrast between a force acting with initiative and a force reacting to sudden pressure became a decisive factor, illustrating how mental resilience can shape battlefield outcomes. Environmental factors continued to influence operations. Snow-covered plains facilitated rapid, armored maneuvers in certain sectors, but also created hazards when roads became icy or thawed to mud. Frozen rivers allowed maneuver in unexpected directions, creating opportunities for German flanking attacks. Conversely, urban rubble complicated movement, limited line of sight for tanks and artillery, and required infantry to engage in intensive clearing operations. Understanding and exploiting these environmental variables was critical to maintaining momentum and maximizing operational effectiveness. Both sides had to adapt constantly, integrating terrain, weather, and mechanical constraints into every tactical and strategic decision. German operational planning emphasized flexibility, coordination, and exploitation of Soviet weaknesses. Armored spearheads advanced rapidly, supported by artillery barges and infantry securing flanks and urban positions. Mechanized units exploited gaps between Soviet divisions, striking at critical junctions and supply lines to further disrupt the retreat. Artillery, positioned in concealed locations, delivered precise and concentrated fire on both defensive positions and withdrawal routes. This orchestration of combined arms operations demonstrated the effectiveness of operational art in practice, showing how timing, coordination, and situational awareness could multiply combat effectiveness even against numerically superior forces. Soviet attempts to regroup were hampered by both environmental and operational constraints. Communication lines were fragmented, and coordination across the sprawling front proved difficult under constant pressure. Isolated units were often forced to engage in delaying actions, fighting to protect supply routes or provide time for retreating forces to consolidate. Armored and mechanized formations faced challenges maneuvering through contested and frozen terrain, while infantry units contended with exhaustion, cold, and exposure. Despite numerical superiority, these limitations highlighted the critical role of operational planning, coordination, and logistics in sustaining effective combat operations under adverse conditions. The strategic importance of maintaining control over Kharkov and surrounding areas became increasingly evident. The city, along with its transportation networks and industrial zones, was a vital hub for both logistical support and operational maneuver. Securing these areas allowed the Germans to stabilize the southern sector of the Eastern Front, consolidate gains, and prepare for further operations against Soviet forces in Ukraine. Conversely, Soviet losses and disorganization in these critical zones limited their ability to regain the initiative, forcing them into a reactive posture that made further advances risky. The interplay between territory, logistics, and operational momentum shaped the unfolding narrative, illustrating how geography and infrastructure can directly influence military outcomes. By early March 1943, the German counteroffensive had successfully reversed the momentum of the Red Army's advance. What had initially been a rapid Soviet push into eastern Ukraine had been transformed into a methodical retreat under pressure, punctuated by encirclement, urban combat, and logistical disruption. The ability of the Wehrmacht to recover from the debacle at Stalingrad, exploit enemy overextension, and execute precision maneuvers highlighted both operational ingenuity and the enduring importance of leadership, discipline, and environmental mastery in determining battlefield outcomes. Kharkov itself, battered yet resilient, stood as the focal point of a dramatic reversal, setting the stage for Germany's last great victory on the Eastern Front. As the German momentum increased, the Soviets struggled to stabilize their defensive lines. Retreating units faced constant harassment from mechanized German formations, which exploited every gap and weakness along the front. Tanks moved with remarkable speed through frozen terrain, striking at vulnerable flanks, while infantry secured strategic urban and industrial positions, cutting off potential escape routes. Artillery delivered relentless barrages on retreating forces, disrupting attempts at regrouping and forcing many units into disorderly withdrawals. This phase highlighted the lethal combination of maneuver warfare, precision firepower, and psychological pressure, demonstrating how initiative could decisively shift the tide of battle. Urban districts within Kharkov became epicenters of fierce engagement. German forces, leveraging tactical coordination and intelligence on Soviet dispositions, systematically cleared factories, rail yards, and residential streets. Soviet defenders, though determined, were often isolated, cut off from reinforcements, and facing shortages of ammunition and supplies. The Germans applied combined arms tactics with fluidity, using armor, infantry, and artillery in concert to neutralize pockets of resistance. Each street and building became a microcosm of the larger operational struggle, illustrating the intricate interplay of tactical skill, environmental awareness, and human endurance on the battlefield. The winter environment continued to exert a profound influence on operations. Snow and ice offered mobility advantages in some sectors, but slowed movements in others, while frozen rivers both facilitated and hindered troop maneuvers. Cold temperatures affected soldiers' stamina, the functioning of vehicles, and the reliability of weapons. German forces, however, had adapted to these conditions, using environmental knowledge to gain tactical advantages, conceal movements, and coordinate precise attacks. The ability to integrate terrain and weather into operational planning proved essential for maintaining momentum and achieving objectives in conditions that could easily negate less disciplined forces. Psychologically, the battle tested both sides to their limits. German troops, buoyed by the restoration of initiative and early successes, gained confidence and cohesion, enhancing their operational effectiveness. Conversely, Soviet units faced increasing stress, confusion, and fatigue as they contended with encirclement, urban combat, and relentless attacks. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline and morale under extremely challenging conditions. The interplay of morale, initiative, and operational effectiveness demonstrated how psychological factors could amplify the impact of tactical and strategic decisions on the battlefield. Logistics remained a pivotal factor throughout the German advance. Maintaining a steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements ensured that mechanized units could continue rapid maneuvers, artillery could sustain bombardments, and infantry could secure urban sectors. Engineers repaired roads, cleared obstacles, and supported the mobility of armored divisions, highlighting the essential role of logistical planning in modern warfare. The synchronization of logistics with operational execution allowed German forces to exploit opportunities created by Soviet overextension, sustaining the tempo necessary to convert tactical actions into strategic gains. Soviet attempts to counter the German advance were increasingly desperate. Isolated units mounted localized counterattacks or attempted breakout operations, often suffering severe casualties or being forced to surrender. Fragmented communication and overextended supply lines limited the effectiveness of these maneuvers. Despite numerical superiority, the lack of operational cohesion and the precise timing of German strikes reduced the impact of Soviet resistance. This stage of the battle underscored a crucial principle of warfare. Numerical advantage can be neutralized by superior operational planning, coordination, and the ability to exploit vulnerabilities in enemy deployments. The strategic importance of Kharkov and its surrounding regions became ever more apparent. Control over transportation networks, industrial facilities, and urban centers allowed the Germans to stabilize the southern sector of the Eastern Front, regain the initiative, and create conditions for further operations against Soviet forces. Conversely, the Soviet retreat highlighted the limitations of rapid advance without secure lines of communication, logistical support, and coordinated defensive planning. Territory, infrastructure, and operational tempo converged to define the dynamics of this critical engagement. By mid-March 1943, the German counteroffensive had successfully transformed the battlefield. The Red Army, which had entered Ukraine with momentum and ambition, was forced into a reactive posture, retreating under pressure, sustaining casualties, and ceding control of critical areas. The Wehrmacht, leveraging operational precision, environmental mastery, and disciplined execution, had regained the initiative. Kharkov, battered yet central to the unfolding operations, stood as the symbol of a dramatic reversal in fortunes, where strategy, timing, and human resilience converged to produce one of Germany's last great victories on the Eastern Front. The turning tide at Kharkov encapsulated the broader lessons of the Eastern Front. Initiative, coordination, and adaptability could outweigh numerical superiority. Environmental mastery could amplify operational effectiveness, and psychological resilience could shape both tactical and strategic outcomes. The combination of these factors during the Soviet retreat demonstrated the enduring importance of operational art in modern mechanized warfare and set the stage for the subsequent phases of the battle, where the interplay of strategy, endurance, and timing would continue to define the course of events. Chapter 8: German Operational Mastery. Mechanized warfare at its peak. Following the Soviet retreat, the German forces capitalized on their regained momentum with a focus on mechanized warfare, demonstrating a level of operational mastery rarely seen on the Eastern Front. Manstein's counteroffensive had shifted the dynamics of the battlefield. The Wehrmacht was no longer on the defensive, and mechanized units were now spearheading rapid, coordinated strikes into the overextended Soviet lines. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, and motorized infantry moved in unison, exploiting gaps, seizing key terrain, and maintaining pressure on retreating forces. The effectiveness of these maneuvers highlighted the precision and flexibility that defined German operational art, transforming battlefield initiative into decisive strategic advantage. The integration of combined arms was central to the German approach. Mechanized units were supported by coordinated artillery fire, which softened enemy positions and disrupted communications. Infantry followed closely, securing captured positions, clearing urban terrain, and protecting armored flanks. Engineers ensured mobility by repairing roads, clearing obstacles, and constructing makeshift bridges, facilitating the rapid advance of heavy armor. This integration of tanks, artillery, infantry, and logistical support created a force multiplier, allowing numerically inferior German units to achieve local superiority and dictate the tempo of engagements. Every movement, every deployment, was calculated to maintain operational initiative and exploit Soviet vulnerabilities. Kharkov and its surrounding areas became a proving ground for these tactics. Urban districts, industrial complexes, and transportation hubs were systematically targeted by the Germans to disrupt Soviet defensive cohesion. Mechanized units maneuvered along frozen rivers and through snow-laden roads, circumventing heavily defended positions, while artillery and infantry applied pressure on multiple axes. Soviet units, although numerically superior, were unable to coordinate effectively, often becoming isolated or overwhelmed. The city's ruins and industrial zones amplified the intensity of combat, turning every street, building, and rail yard into a critical point of confrontation. The Germans leveraged their operational flexibility to exploit these complexities, turning the environment itself into a force multiplier. The psychological dimension of mechanized warfare was equally significant. German forces, executing coordinated strikes with speed and precision, demonstrated confidence and discipline that contrasted sharply with the reactive posture of Soviet units. Soldiers witnessed the devastating effect of combined arms operations, which shattered morale, created confusion, and forced hasty withdrawals. For the Soviets, even well-entrenched units faced the psychological strain of being maneuvered into disadvantageous positions, surrounded, or threatened by rapidly advancing armored spearheads. The impact of mechanized warfare extended beyond the physical destruction of forces. It imposed a mental burden that shaped decision-making and operational effectiveness across the battlefield. Environmental conditions continued to play a critical role in the execution of mechanized operations. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures affected mobility, visibility, and the reliability of both men and machinery. Tanks could traverse frozen rivers, but risked immobilization on thawing roads. Infantry had to negotiate snowdrifts, rubble, and damaged urban terrain while maintaining coordination with armored units. Despite these challenges, German units had adapted their operational procedures to leverage environmental conditions, using frozen terrain for surprise maneuvers and snow-covered forests to conceal movements. Mastery of environmental variables amplified the effectiveness of combined arms operations, demonstrating that operational success depended as much on adaptability as on firepower or numbers. Logistics remained a pivotal enabler of mechanized warfare. Fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support had to be coordinated with precision to sustain the pace of armored advances. Engineers cleared obstacles, repaired damaged roads, and ensured the continuous flow of reinforcements and supplies. This synchronization allowed mechanized units to maintain momentum, strike multiple targets in quick succession, and exploit gaps in the Soviet defensive lines. The careful integration of logistics into operational planning illustrated the sophistication of German command, turning potential vulnerabilities into strengths and sustaining offensive operations under severe winter conditions. The German operational approach emphasized both timing and flexibility. Armored thrusts were launched precisely when Soviet formations were most vulnerable, exploiting gaps and weak points. Infantry and artillery followed closely, consolidating gains, securing captured terrain, and preventing counterattacks. This synergy of mobility, firepower, and tactical coordination allowed the Germans to dictate the pace of battle, forcing the Soviets into reactive maneuvers and continuous withdrawals. The interplay of initiative, timing, and operational flexibility transformed the battlefield into a dynamic environment where strategic outcomes could be shaped by disciplined execution rather than sheer numerical superiority. By mid-March 1943, the German emphasis on mechanized warfare had produced tangible results. Soviet units were in retreat, communications were disrupted, and supply lines were under constant threat. German armor and infantry had seized critical positions, stabilized the front around Kharkov, and set the stage for further operations in the southern sector of Ukraine. The effectiveness of mechanized warfare, combined with environmental mastery and operational foresight, demonstrated the enduring value of coordination, precision, and flexibility in modern combat. The lessons from this phase would resonate beyond Kharkov, highlighting how a well-led, disciplined, and adaptive force could achieve decisive results even when confronted by numerically superior opponents. As German mechanized units pressed their advantage, the full impact of operational mastery became evident across the Kharkov battlefield. Tanks moved with precision, exploiting frozen terrain and gaps between Soviet formations, while motorized infantry secured flanks, urban strongpoints, and strategic transportation routes. Artillery delivered concentrated, coordinated barrages that disrupted enemy defenses and sapped morale. This seamless integration of armor, infantry, and firepower allowed the Wehrmacht to maintain relentless pressure, dictating the pace of operations and forcing the Red Army into a continuous series of reactive maneuvers. The battlefield, previously fluid and uncertain, became a testament to the effectiveness of combined arms warfare executed with precision. Urban districts and industrial areas remained the most contested zones. German forces systematically cleared factories, rail yards, and residential streets, often isolating pockets of Soviet resistance before eliminating them. Soviet units, while determined, were increasingly hampered by fragmented communications, exhaustion, and disrupted supply lines. The Germans' ability to coordinate multiple combat elements across these complex environments amplified their effectiveness, enabling them to achieve localized superiority and impose strategic pressure on a retreating opponent. The dynamic interplay of urban terrain, mechanized mobility, and combined arms tactics transformed Kharkov into both a proving ground and a crucible for operational skill, Environmental conditions continued to shape engagements in decisive ways. Frozen rivers facilitated armored maneuvers that caught Soviet units off guard, while snow-covered forests concealed troop movements and allowed for flanking attacks. Conversely, thawing ground and rubble-strewn streets limited mobility, requiring German commanders to adapt in real time. The operational emphasis on environmental mastery underscored the importance of adaptability in modern mechanized warfare. Both sides faced the same harsh winter conditions, yet the Germans' superior integration of terrain, timing, and maneuver amplified their tactical and operational effectiveness, turning environmental challenges into decisive advantages. Psychological factors also played a crucial role. The speed, precision, and coordination of German operations created a sense of inevitability among Soviet forces. Retreating units faced not only physical pressure but also the mental strain of continuous harassment, the threat of encirclement, and the unpredictability of mechanized attacks. For German soldiers, the successful execution of complex maneuvers reinforced morale, unit cohesion, and confidence in leadership. The psychological dimension of mechanized warfare, where perception, pressure, and uncertainty could amplify operational outcomes, proved as decisive as firepower or numerical advantage. Logistics remained central to sustaining mechanized operations. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were coordinated meticulously to maintain momentum. Engineers ensured mobility, cleared obstacles, and repaired damaged roads, facilitating uninterrupted advances. Artillery positions were resupplied and repositioned to support ongoing operations, maintaining pressure on Soviet formations. This synchronization of logistics and combat execution allowed German forces to exploit operational opportunities fully, illustrating how strategic foresight and careful planning could compensate for numerical inferiority. The operational effectiveness of mechanized warfare at Kharkov was as much a product of meticulous planning as of battlefield execution. The tactical flexibility of German forces became increasingly apparent as operations continued. Armored spearheads could be redirected in response to Soviet movements. Infantry secured newly gained terrain, and artillery adapted to changing lines of engagement. This operational fluidity prevented Soviet forces from consolidating or regaining initiative, ensuring that the Germans retained the momentum of the campaign. Mechanized warfare, when combined with effective reconnaissance and leadership, allowed for rapid exploitation of enemy weaknesses and created the conditions for successive operational successes. By late March 1943, the mechanized offensive had fundamentally altered the balance of power around Kharkov. Soviet forces were in retreat, with morale and cohesion under strain, while German forces had stabilized key sectors and secured critical positions. Mechanized units continued to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's lines, integrating urban combat, open field maneuver, and artillery support with remarkable precision. The success of these operations highlighted the decisive impact of combined arms tactics, environmental awareness, and logistical synchronization in modern warfare. Kharkov stood as a testament to the operational brilliance of Manstein and the effectiveness of mechanized warfare when executed with skill, discipline, and foresight. The lessons of Kharkov during this phase were clear. Numerical superiority alone could not guarantee success. Initiative, coordination, and adaptability were decisive. And environmental mastery could transform challenges into strategic advantages. German mechanized warfare at Kharkov represented a high-water mark of operational execution on the Eastern Front, showcasing how a well-led and disciplined force could achieve strategic results even in the face of formidable opposition. The combination of speed, precision, and flexibility ensured that the Wehrmacht could exploit Soviet vulnerabilities and achieve one of its last major victories of the campaign. Chapter 9: Streets of Fire. Urban combat in Kharkov. As German mechanized units pushed deeper into Kharkov, the city itself became a theater of intense urban warfare. Streets, factories, and residential districts turned into a labyrinth of danger where every corner could conceal an enemy, every building a potential stronghold. The battle for Kharkov was no longer defined solely by maneuver and mobility. It had evolved into a grueling contest of tactical skill, endurance, and ingenuity. Soldiers on both sides faced relentless challenges, from the constant threat of snipers and machine gun nests to the hazards posed by rubble-strewn streets, collapsed buildings, and artillery debris. Urban combat magnified the stakes, where even minor tactical missteps could have catastrophic consequences. German forces approached urban operations with careful planning and coordination. Infantry moved in conjunction with armored units, clearing streets and securing key positions before tanks advanced to exploit gaps and suppress fortified positions. Artillery fire was employed strategically to neutralize stubborn resistance or create corridors for maneuver. Engineers played a crucial role, clearing debris, bridging trenches, and facilitating movement through the ruined cityscape. Each operation was conducted with the precision of combined arms tactics, ensuring that infantry, armor, and artillery worked in harmony to overcome the unique challenges posed by urban terrain. Soviet defenders, though increasingly pressured by German advances, demonstrated remarkable resilience. Factories, warehouses, and residential buildings became defensive strongpoints, where small units could hold out against larger forces. Machine gun emplacements, sniper positions, and improvised barricades slowed German advances and forced careful tactical coordination. Soviet troops utilized intimate knowledge of the city's streets and industrial complexes to stage ambushes and harass advancing units. Yet despite their tenacity, the fragmented nature of Soviet defense, compounded by overextension and disrupted communications, made sustained resistance increasingly difficult as the German counteroffensive intensified. The psychological toll of urban combat in Kharkov was profound. Soldiers faced relentless stress, exposure to extreme winter conditions, and the constant threat of sudden death around every corner. Close quarters fighting amplified fear, fatigue, and confusion, with the noise of artillery, gunfire, and collapsing structures creating a chaotic and disorienting environment. German units, executing disciplined maneuvers and coordinated assaults, maintained morale through clear objectives, operational confidence, and the psychological advantage of initiative. Soviet forces, by contrast, contended with uncertainty, isolation, and the cumulative effect of repeated setbacks, underscoring how urban combat could profoundly affect the mental resilience of soldiers. Environmental conditions added another layer of complexity to urban engagements. Snow and ice covered streets and rooftops, affecting both movement and visibility. Rubble and damaged infrastructure created obstacles that slowed armored vehicles and infantry alike, requiring careful navigation and improvisation. Weather conditions, coupled with the chaos of urban combat, demanded adaptive tactics, rapid decision-making, and continuous coordination between units. The ability to exploit terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and integrate environmental factors into tactical planning proved critical for operational success. Tactical flexibility was a hallmark of German urban operations. Infantry units advanced cautiously, securing buildings and intersections, while armored units flanked Soviet positions to prevent counterattacks. Artillery provided covering fire, targeting strongpoints or clearing paths for advancing troops. Engineers addressed logistical challenges, ensuring that roads, bridges, and pathways were accessible for mechanized movements. This combination of foresight, coordination, and adaptability allowed the Germans to maintain pressure, exploit weaknesses, and gradually consolidate control over key sectors of the city. The battle for Kharkov's industrial zones was particularly intense. Factories and warehouses, with their dense structures and complex layouts, became heavily contested areas where both sides fought fiercely for control. German units employed systematic clearing tactics, while Soviet defenders used barricades, sniper positions, and defensive fire to slow their progress. Control of these zones was strategically significant as it influenced supply, maneuverability, and overall operational momentum. The interplay between industrial terrain, urban density, and combat tactics created high-stakes environments where operational art and tactical skill were tested to the fullest. By mid-March 1943, German forces had gained significant ground within Kharkov, yet the city remained a battleground of intermittent skirmishes and localized resistance. Urban combat had slowed the tempo of operations in some areas, but also allowed German commanders to isolate and neutralize pockets of Soviet resistance systematically. The combination of mechanized mobility, coordinated infantry assaults, and artillery support ensured that momentum remained on the side of the Wehrmacht, even in the challenging environment of the city. Kharkov had become both a proving ground for operational skill and a crucible where endurance, strategy, and tactical ingenuity converged. The battle within Kharkov's streets intensified as German forces pressed forward, seeking to consolidate control over the city while countering Soviet defensive efforts. Every district presented unique challenges. Narrow streets, collapsed buildings, and industrial complexes created natural choke points, while Soviet defenders exploited the urban landscape to stage ambushes, maintain sniper positions, and establish fortified positions. The German approach relied on careful coordination between mechanized units, infantry, and artillery, ensuring that tanks could move where needed, infantry could clear strongpoints, and artillery could neutralize positions without endangering friendly forces. Urban combat demanded precise timing, disciplined maneuvering, and constant adaptation to the unpredictable environment. Soviet units, though under pressure, demonstrated remarkable tenacity in resisting the German advance. Small squads effectively utilized the ruins, factories, and railway complexes to slow progress and inflict casualties. Improvised barricades and hidden firing positions allowed defenders to channel attackers into kill zones, making each block and street a potential trap. Communication difficulties and disjointed command structures, however, limited the ability of Soviet units to mount coordinated defenses. Isolated pockets of resistance were gradually overcome by systematic German clearing operations, which combined mobility, firepower, and tactical patience to reduce risks and maintain operational tempo. The psychological aspect of fighting in Kharkov was as deadly as the physical threats. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, fatigue, constant artillery bombardments, and the unpredictability of close-quarters combat. German troops, trained for rapid urban assaults and coordinated maneuvers, relied on confidence, discipline, and the momentum of previous successes to maintain effectiveness. Soviet defenders, although determined, faced stress from encirclement, exposure, and the constant threat of mechanized strikes or artillery barrages. The intensity of combat in every street, every building, and every industrial complex tested mental resilience, highlighting the profound psychological dimension of urban warfare. Environmental conditions further complicated operations. Snow and ice created hazards for infantry movement and armored maneuvering, while destroyed infrastructure restricted lines of advance and concealment. The Germans adapted by using frozen rivers and open squares for armored thrusts, while urban rubble and industrial layouts forced close coordination between infantry and tanks. Winter conditions were leveraged strategically, creating avenues for surprise attacks, defensive traps, and operational deception. Soldiers had to continuously adapt to changing terrain, weather, and enemy movements, making situational awareness a decisive factor in survival and operational effectiveness. The German use of combined arms tactics reached its peak during these urban operations. Infantry would systematically clear buildings, factories, and intersections, while armored units provided firepower and mobility to bypass or neutralize enemy strongpoints. Artillery units delivered targeted barrages to weaken defenses, suppress counterattacks, and create pathways for advancement. Engineers maintained mobility by clearing debris, repairing streets, and facilitating movement for both tanks and supply convoys. This seamless integration of multiple elements allowed the Wehrmacht to overcome Soviet resistance methodically, demonstrating operational precision in one of the most challenging urban combat environments of the Eastern Front. Control of industrial zones was especially critical. Factories, warehouses, and rail yards influenced supply lines, troop movements, and strategic positioning. German forces systematically captured and secured these zones, denying Soviet forces key operational advantages. Each capture not only provided tactical benefits, but also contributed to the broader operational goal of stabilizing the front and consolidating control over Kharkov. The struggle for industrial areas underscored the interconnection between urban terrain, strategic objectives, and operational execution, illustrating the complexity and significance of urban combat in large-scale operations. By late March 1943, the German forces had gained dominance over most of Kharkov. While isolated Soviet pockets remained, their capacity to influence the broader battle was severely diminished. The systematic clearing of streets, the capture of industrial sectors, and the coordination of mechanized and infantry operations allowed the Wehrmacht to maintain momentum, secure key positions, and prepare for subsequent operational phases. The city itself, though devastated by continuous fighting, became a testament to the effectiveness of combined arms tactics and the importance of urban control in determining operational outcomes. The urban combat in Kharkov highlighted the multifaceted nature of warfare on the Eastern Front. Success required more than brute force. It demanded operational foresight, adaptability, environmental mastery, and the psychological resilience of soldiers. German forces, through meticulous planning and precise execution, demonstrated the power of mechanized and combined arms warfare even in the most challenging urban terrain. Kharkov stood as both a battlefield and a proving ground, where strategy, tactics, and human endurance converged to shape one of Germany's last significant victories in the East. Chapter 10: Logistics and Supply. The Lifeblood of the Counteroffensive, Part 1. As the German forces solidified their gains around Kharkov, the importance of logistics and supply lines became increasingly apparent. Success in mechanized warfare was not solely dependent on tanks, infantry, or artillery. It was also determined by the ability to maintain a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and medical support. Manstein's operational planning recognized this crucial factor, ensuring that every advance, counterattack, and urban engagement was underpinned by a reliable and adaptable logistical framework. The careful coordination of supplies enabled the Wehrmacht to maintain momentum, sustain combat effectiveness, and exploit vulnerabilities in Soviet positions, Even in the harsh winter conditions of early 1943, German supply chains were a complex network of depots, forward supply points, and transport corridors. Railways played a pivotal role, allowing rapid movement of heavy equipment, fuel, and ammunition into areas of engagement. Trucks and motorized transport bridged the gaps between railheads and frontline units, ensuring that mechanized divisions remained operationally effective. Engineers maintained roads, repaired bridges, and cleared snow-blocked routes to prevent disruptions. The synchronization of these logistical elements with operational planning was a testament to German military engineering and foresight, enabling forces to execute fast-paced maneuvers and urban operations without significant delays. The winter conditions presented both challenges and opportunities for logistics. Frozen rivers could serve as temporary roads for heavy armor, while snow-covered roads sometimes facilitated faster movement than muddy or thawing terrain. Conversely, severe cold threatened vehicle reliability, froze fuel lines, and made manual labor more difficult for supply personnel. Despite these obstacles, German units adapted by implementing strict maintenance schedules, prepositioning supplies, and using specialized equipment to overcome environmental limitations. The ability to integrate environmental considerations into logistical planning was a key factor in sustaining operational momentum and ensuring that mechanized units remained combat-ready. Urban combat further complicated supply operations. Streets filled with rubble, damaged infrastructure, and ongoing skirmishes required constant adaptation of delivery routes and resupply methods. Forward supply points had to be secured against potential Soviet attacks, and engineers often cleared debris to create viable paths for armored and supply vehicles. Coordination between logistics units and combat formations was critical to avoid bottlenecks and ensure that frontline troops received timely support. The synchronization of supply movements with the pace of combat operations underscored the sophistication of German planning and highlighted the often overlooked role of logistics in determining the outcome of battles. Artillery effectiveness, a key component of German tactical success, relied heavily on consistent ammunition supply. Continuous shelling required precise coordination between forward observers, supply depots, and artillery units. Any interruption in the flow of munitions could reduce operational tempo and provide opportunities for Soviet counterattacks. German planners prioritized this aspect of logistics, ensuring that artillery units could maintain sustained fire support for infantry and armored operations. The integration of supply chains with operational objectives demonstrated how logistics, strategy, and tactical execution were inseparably linked on the battlefield. Fuel supply was another critical consideration for the mechanized forces. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, and motorized infantry depended on a steady flow of fuel to maintain mobility, execute flanking maneuvers, and sustain pressure on Soviet units. German supply networks ensured that fuel reached frontline units through a combination of rail, road, and temporary storage points. Maintenance units monitored consumption, managed distribution, and provided emergency support to prevent immobilization. The ability to maintain operational mobility through effective fuel logistics allowed the Wehrmacht to exploit Soviet weaknesses continuously and retain initiative in both urban and open-field engagements. Medical and personnel support also played a crucial role in sustaining combat effectiveness. Casualty evacuation, treatment of frostbite and wounds, and rotation of exhausted units were essential to maintaining morale and operational readiness. Hospitals and field medical units were strategically positioned to provide rapid care, while supply units ensured availability of medical equipment, food, and winter clothing. The holistic approach to logistics, encompassing both material and human factors, enabled German forces to endure the harsh conditions and maintain combat efficiency during the intense fighting around Kharkov. Soviet forces, while numerically superior, often struggled with the coordination and security of their own logistical networks. Extended supply lines, disrupted communications, and rapid German counterattacks limited the Red Army's ability to sustain forward operations effectively. Isolated units faced ammunition shortages, fuel constraints, and difficulty evacuating wounded personnel. The contrast between the German operationally integrated logistics and the Soviet supply difficulties highlighted the critical importance of preparation, adaptability, and foresight in modern mechanized warfare. By mid-March 1943, the efficient functioning of German logistics had directly contributed to the success of mechanized operations, urban clearing, and sustained offensive pressure. Each victory in Kharkov was not merely a product of tactical skill or numerical advantage, but also a reflection of meticulous logistical planning and execution. The interplay between operational objectives, environmental conditions, and supply chains demonstrated that logistics was the lifeblood of the counteroffensive, sustaining the momentum that allowed the Wehrmacht to achieve one of its final significant victories on the Eastern Front. As German forces consolidated their hold over Kharkov, the intricate web of logistics continued to underpin every operational maneuver. The ability to maintain forward momentum in mechanized warfare depended on reliable and flexible supply chains that could adapt to the fluid dynamics of battle. Manstein's operational plans ensured that fuel, ammunition, and other critical resources were continuously available to frontline units, enabling tanks, infantry, and artillery to operate in concert. Without such coordination, even the most disciplined units could falter, highlighting the indispensable role of logistics in achieving sustained battlefield success. The rail network surrounding Kharkov served as the backbone of German supply operations. Depots were strategically placed to facilitate rapid movement of heavy equipment and essential supplies to frontline units. Trains transported tanks, artillery shells, fuel, and provisions across distances that would have been impossible to cover solely by road transport. From these depots, motorized convoys ferried supplies to forward positions, bridging the final kilometers to the front lines. The synchronization of rail, road, and forward depots allowed German forces to sustain intensive mechanized operations, demonstrating how logistical precision could amplify tactical and operational effectiveness in real time. Winter conditions, while challenging, were also managed strategically within the logistical framework. Frozen rivers and snow-covered roads were exploited to accelerate movement, while obstacles such as debris, mud, and damaged bridges were overcome by engineering units. Vehicles were maintained rigorously to prevent breakdowns, fuel lines were protected from freezing, and supplies were pre-positioned to mitigate environmental constraints. This proactive adaptation to the terrain and weather conditions ensured that logistical networks remained resilient, allowing German mechanized units to continue exploiting vulnerabilities in Soviet defensive lines without interruption. Urban combat further complicated logistics. Streets blocked by rubble, destroyed vehicles, and collapsed buildings required engineers to clear paths continually, enabling supply vehicles to reach infantry and armored units. Forward supply points were protected by infantry to prevent disruption by isolated Soviet forces, ensuring that frontline troops received ammunition, food, and medical support without delay. The synchronization of logistics with combat operations required constant communication, rapid decision-making, and flexibility to adjust to sudden changes in the battlefield environment. Every successful resupply reinforced the operational momentum of the German forces and ensured that no unit was left vulnerable due to shortages. Ammunition and artillery logistics were particularly crucial during the urban phase of the battle. Sustained bombardments were required to neutralize Soviet strongpoints, protect advancing infantry, and disrupt counterattacks. Forward observers coordinated with artillery units to ensure accuracy and efficiency, while supply personnel maintained a continuous flow of shells to the guns. Any interruption in this process could slow advances, allow Soviet defenders to regroup, or create opportunities for counterattacks. The careful integration of artillery supply with operational objectives demonstrated the interdependence of combat and logistics in modern warfare. Fuel logistics dictated the operational range and effectiveness of German mechanized units. Tanks and motorized infantry relied on uninterrupted fuel delivery to maintain mobility, execute flanking maneuvers, and apply constant pressure on retreating Soviet forces. Supply networks accounted for fuel consumption, storage, and emergency contingencies, ensuring that armored spearheads could strike rapidly and decisively. Engineers maintained mobility corridors, repaired bridges, and removed obstacles to prevent bottlenecks. This operational foresight allowed German forces to maintain a tempo of advance that the Soviets could not match, highlighting the strategic significance of fuel logistics in mechanized warfare. Medical logistics were another vital component of operational sustainability. Casualties, injuries from extreme cold, and fatigue required a coordinated system for evacuation, treatment, and replacement of personnel. Field hospitals, forward medical posts, and transport systems ensured that wounded soldiers received timely care, while frontline units were rotated or reinforced to maintain combat readiness. The integration of medical support within the broader logistical framework preserved morale, enhanced operational endurance, and allowed German forces to maintain effectiveness despite the rigors of winter combat. By late March 1943, the meticulous planning and execution of logistics had become a decisive factor in the German counteroffensive at Kharkov. The ability to sustain mechanized operations, artillery barges, and urban clearing operations through integrated supply networks ensured that momentum was maintained and operational objectives achieved. The interplay between planning, environmental adaptation, and resource management demonstrated that successful warfare depended as much on logistics as on tactics or numerical strength. German operational success was built upon the foundation of these supply systems, making logistics the lifeblood that enabled one of the Wehrmacht's final major victories on the Eastern Front. Chapter 11. Leadership and Command. Manstein's Tactical Genius. The Battle of Kharkov in 1943 was as much a contest of leadership and command as it was of firepower, terrain, or numbers. At the center of German operations was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, whose operational brilliance and tactical foresight turned a precarious situation into one of the Wehrmacht's last major victories on the Eastern Front. Manstein's approach was marked by a rare combination of patience, audacity, and meticulous attention to detail. He understood that the success of the counteroffensive depended not only on maneuver and firepower, but also on timing, coordination, and psychological impact, both on his own troops and on the Red Army. Manstein's leadership style emphasized flexibility and initiative within a framework of clear objectives. He allowed subordinate commanders the autonomy to make tactical decisions while ensuring that these actions remained aligned with the broader operational plan. This approach maximized responsiveness to changing battlefield conditions, enabling German forces to exploit opportunities as they arose. Mechanized units, infantry, and artillery operated with both independence and coordination, a balance that allowed swift adaptation to Soviet movements, urban complexities, and environmental challenges. Manstein's command philosophy highlighted the importance of decentralized execution within centralized planning, a principle that became crucial during the fast-paced mechanized operations around Kharkov. Operational intelligence and reconnaissance were central to Manstein's decision-making. Accurate knowledge of Soviet dispositions, strengths, and vulnerabilities allowed him to time counterattacks with precision. Reconnaissance units provided detailed reports on terrain, enemy movements, and weak points, enabling German commanders to concentrate forces effectively. By integrating intelligence with operational planning, Manstein ensured that each maneuver, from armored thrusts to urban clearing operations, was based on a clear understanding of both the physical and psychological battlefield. The ability to anticipate Soviet actions and exploit overextensions turned information into a decisive weapon, enhancing both efficiency and lethality. Timing was another hallmark of Manstein's leadership. The counteroffensive around Kharkov was not a hasty reaction, but a carefully orchestrated response to Soviet overextension. German forces allowed the Red Army to advance into vulnerable positions before striking with precision, encircling and isolating units in a series of calculated moves. The synchronization of armored spearheads, infantry advances, artillery barges, and logistical support exemplified the operational art that Manstein mastered. The ability to coordinate multiple elements across a dynamic battlefield demonstrated not only tactical skill, but also a deep understanding of how initiative, timing, and momentum interact to produce decisive outcomes. The psychological dimension of leadership was equally significant. Manstein maintained morale among German troops by clearly communicating objectives, demonstrating confidence, and providing visible direction during critical operations. Soldiers understood both their immediate tasks and the strategic importance of their actions, fostering cohesion and discipline even under extreme winter conditions and in the chaos of urban combat. In contrast, Soviet forces faced the cumulative stress of repeated setbacks, encirclement threats, and disrupted command structures, highlighting how effective leadership could amplify operational advantage beyond the physical capabilities of troops or equipment. Urban combat required Manstein to coordinate complex, multi-layered operations. Infantry, mechanized units, and artillery had to work in synchrony, adapting to the unique challenges of street fighting, industrial zones, and residential districts. Commanders relied on both pre-planned strategies and real-time intelligence to make rapid decisions, ensuring that units could respond to sudden changes in enemy positions or environmental obstacles. This level of operational coordination underscored Manstein's ability to blend strategic foresight with tactical flexibility, turning chaos into controlled, decisive action. Logistics and supply, closely tied to leadership decisions, were another testament to Manstein's operational genius. He understood that maintaining momentum required not only planning maneuvers, but also ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements were consistently available. Supply lines were integrated with operational timelines. Engineers were pre-positioned to clear routes, and forward depots were secured to prevent disruption. The seamless connection between leadership decisions and logistical execution allowed German forces to maintain the pace, intensity, and effectiveness of operations, demonstrating the interdependence of command and supply in modern mechanized warfare. To be why mid-March 1943, Manstein's leadership had transformed the battlefield. The German counteroffensive had regained the initiative, encircled Soviet units, and pushed the Red Army into a strategic retreat. His operational decisions ensured that mechanized forces could exploit vulnerabilities, infantry could secure urban positions, and artillery could maintain continuous pressure. The combination of timing, intelligence, psychological insight, and logistical integration exemplified the qualities of a commander capable of turning adversity into opportunity. Manstein's tactical genius was a decisive factor in Germany's last significant victory on the Eastern Front, demonstrating that leadership could shape outcomes as profoundly as firepower or numbers. As the counteroffensive around Kharkov progressed, the impact of Manstein's leadership became increasingly evident across the battlefield. German forces moved with cohesion, precision, and confidence, translating operational plans into effective action. The synchronization of mechanized spearheads, infantry advances, and artillery support reflected not only careful planning, but also a command philosophy that valued adaptability, initiative, and clear communication. Manstein's foresight ensured that each movement, from encircling maneuvers to urban clearing operations, was executed with maximum efficiency and strategic purpose. One of Manstein's key strengths was his ability to anticipate Soviet reactions. By studying enemy dispositions, movement patterns, and past operational behavior, he predicted where Soviet units were likely to overextend or become vulnerable. This allowed German forces to concentrate their strength at decisive points, striking with overwhelming force and achieving local superiority despite overall numerical inferiority. Encirclement operations, rapid flanking maneuvers, and targeted urban assaults were all products of this anticipatory approach, demonstrating how informed, proactive leadership could magnify the effectiveness of tactical and operational decisions. Communication and coordination were central to Manstein's operational genius. Orders were transmitted clearly and efficiently, allowing subordinate commanders to act decisively within the framework of broader strategic objectives. This balance of centralized planning and decentralized execution enabled rapid responses to changing battlefield conditions, whether in open terrain or the dense streets of Kharkov. Mechanized units could exploit gaps, infantry could clear urban strongpoints, and artillery could provide timely fire support, all working in harmony toward a unified goal. Such synchronization reflected an advanced understanding of operational art, where leadership, timing, and execution converged to produce decisive outcomes. The psychological dimension of command was also critical. Manstein maintained morale and cohesion among German troops through visible leadership, confidence in decision-making, and careful management of operational tempo. Soldiers understood the importance of their actions, the objectives of each maneuver, and the broader significance of their contributions to the campaign. In contrast, Soviet units, under fragmented command and constant operational pressure, often experienced confusion, stress, and diminished cohesion. This psychological contrast, shaped by effective leadership, proved as influential as firepower or maneuver in determining battlefield outcomes. Urban operations demanded exceptional adaptability from commanders. Manstein ensured that units could respond to unexpected resistance, navigate complex city layouts, and maintain coordination despite disruptions caused by rubble, debris, and enemy fire. Infantry and mechanized forces were trained to operate in concert, supported by artillery barges that neutralized strongpoints and created avenues of advance. Engineers facilitated mobility, cleared obstacles, and maintained supply routes, allowing the operational plan to proceed without interruption. Leadership at both strategic and tactical levels ensured that German forces retained the initiative even in the chaotic environment of urban combat. Manstein's operational brilliance also extended to the management of reserves and reinforcements. By holding key units in reserve, he could respond to unforeseen challenges, exploit emerging opportunities, and reinforce sectors under pressure. This flexibility allowed German forces to maintain the initiative, counter Soviet counterattacks, and consolidate gains in both urban and open terrain. The careful allocation and timing of reserves underscored the depth of Manstein's strategic thinking, highlighting the interplay between foresight, adaptability, and effective command in modern mechanized warfare. Logistical foresight was another critical component of his leadership. Manstein recognized that operational success depended on maintaining the flow of fuel, ammunition, and medical support to frontline units. Supply networks were integrated with operational timelines, ensuring that mechanized spearheads, infantry, and artillery remained effective. Engineers cleared and repaired routes, depots were secured, and supply movements were coordinated to prevent disruption. This holistic approach to command, which linked strategic vision with practical logistical execution, ensured sustained operational tempo and maximized combat effectiveness throughout the counteroffensive. By late March 1943, the results of Manstein's leadership were unmistakable. German forces had regained the initiative, encircled Soviet units, and consolidated control over Kharkov. Mechanized operations, urban clearing, and artillery support all benefited from his guidance, while coordination, timing, and psychological insight amplified the impact of each tactical action. The battle demonstrated that effective leadership could shape the outcome of engagements even in the face of numerical and environmental challenges. Manstein's tactical genius was a decisive factor in achieving one of Germany's last significant victories on the Eastern Front, proving that the interplay of strategy, execution, and human factors could determine the course of war. Chapter 12: Soviet Strategy and Errors. Lessons from Overextension. While the German counteroffensive under Manstein demonstrated operational brilliance, the Battle of Kharkov in 1943 also revealed critical vulnerabilities within Soviet strategy and planning. The Red Army's rapid advance into the southern Ukrainian sector, driven by the momentum gained after the winter victory at Stalingrad, created overextended lines, dispersed units, and logistical strains that would prove disastrous. Despite superior numbers, the Soviets struggled to maintain cohesion, coordinate defensive measures, and respond effectively to the German counterattack, illustrating how strategic overreach can undermine even the most powerful forces. The Soviet advance prior to the counteroffensive was characterized by speed and ambition. Bolstered by numerical superiority and a series of victories, Soviet forces sought to exploit perceived weaknesses in the German lines, liberate occupied cities, and reclaim territory swiftly. However, this push often outpaced the establishment of secure supply lines, proper defensive preparations, and coordinated communications between units. Mechanized formations surged forward, while infantry lagged behind, creating gaps and isolated positions that the Germans would later exploit. The pursuit of operational momentum, while tactically impressive, laid the groundwork for vulnerability, highlighting the delicate balance between offensive ambition and sustainable strategy. Command and coordination issues plagued Soviet operations during this phase. Rapid advances, fragmented units, and limited situational awareness hindered the ability of commanders to issue timely orders and maintain operational cohesion. Frontline units often found themselves isolated, facing mechanized German attacks without sufficient support or reserves. Communication breakdowns prevented the effective sharing of intelligence and restricted the capacity to respond to encirclement threats. These systemic challenges underscored the consequences of overextension. Numerical superiority could be rendered ineffective if forces were dispersed, disorganized, or poorly coordinated. Logistical challenges compounded the strategic difficulties faced by the Soviets. The extended supply line struggled to keep pace with advancing troops, limiting access to ammunition, fuel, and provisions. Overstretched railways, damaged infrastructure, and harsh winter conditions further exacerbated shortages. Units on the front lines often experienced supply disruptions, forcing improvisation under extremely stressful conditions. The contrast with German logistics, meticulously synchronized with operational objectives, highlighted the crucial role of supply in sustaining both offensive and defensive operations, particularly in the context of mechanized warfare. Soviet overconfidence played a subtle yet critical role in the unfolding disaster. Buoyed by previous successes and the momentum gained after Stalingrad, Red Army planners underestimated the potential for a coordinated German counteroffensive. Assumptions about the Wehrmacht's weakened state and the perceived vulnerability of German positions contributed to aggressive advances without adequate security measures. The failure to anticipate a rapid, well-coordinated German response demonstrated the dangers of overestimating one's position and underestimating the enemy's operational capabilities, a lesson with enduring significance in military history. The operational vulnerabilities created by overextension manifested dramatically during the German counteroffensive. Encirclement tactics exploited gaps between Soviet units. Mechanized spearheads struck exposed flanks, and infantry attacks isolated and neutralized pockets of resistance. Units that had advanced aggressively were now forced into reactive defense, facing both physical pressure and psychological strain. The Red Army's inability to consolidate positions, secure supply lines, and maintain coherent communication chains turned numerical advantage into a liability, emphasizing the importance of operational depth, redundancy, and adaptability in modern warfare. Terrain and environmental factors further magnified Soviet difficulties. Winter conditions, including snow, ice, and frozen rivers, created both opportunities and hazards. While some terrain allowed rapid movement, other areas hindered supply and maneuver, particularly for overextended or isolated units. Urban centers like Kharkov became traps where dispersed Soviet formations were forced into close-quarters combat against coordinated German forces. The Red Army's insufficient preparation for urban engagement, combined with logistical and command limitations, amplified vulnerabilities, demonstrating the intersection of environmental mastery, operational planning, and strategic foresight in shaping outcomes. The Soviet response to German pressure highlighted further strategic shortcomings. Attempts to mount counterattacks or reinforce threatened sectors were often delayed, fragmented, or misdirected, reflecting both command disarray and logistical constraints. Isolated units, cut off from reinforcements or ammunition, suffered heavy casualties or were forced into surrender. While some formations displayed remarkable resilience, the broader operational picture was one of disorder and reactive maneuvers. The battle thus became an instructive case study in how overextension, miscommunication, and logistical strain can neutralize advantages and create conditions for enemy exploitation. By mid-March 1943, the Red Army's overreach had become a decisive factor in the unfolding battle. While initial advances had created opportunities for territorial gain, the failure to anticipate a coordinated counteroffensive, secure supply lines, and maintain operational cohesion left Soviet units vulnerable. The consequences were stark: encirclements, significant casualties, loss of urban centers, and forced retreats that undermined both morale and strategic objectives. The Battle of Kharkov thus illustrated that success in mechanized warfare depends not solely on numbers or momentum, but also on careful planning, coordination, and the ability to adapt to dynamic operational realities. The German counteroffensive at Kharkov exposed the full consequences of Soviet overextension. Isolated units, spread thin across an expansive front, were vulnerable to the Wehrmacht's concentrated mechanized thrusts. Tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery exploited gaps between divisions, cutting off supply routes, encircling formations, and forcing hasty withdrawals. What had initially seemed like a steady advance into Ukraine now became a precarious position, illustrating that operational success requires more than forward momentum. It demands depth, cohesion, and the ability to absorb and respond to enemy initiatives. One of the key lessons from the Soviet failures was the danger of dispersing forces without adequate support. Red Army divisions advanced rapidly into Kharkov and surrounding areas, often leaving flanks exposed and creating gaps that German forces could exploit. Mechanized spearheads, operating with speed and coordination, penetrated these weak points, encircling units and cutting them off from reinforcements or supplies. Soviet command structures struggled to react effectively, with orders delayed or miscommunicated, highlighting how overextension compromises both operational control and the ability to coordinate defenses under pressure. Logistics again proved to be a critical weakness for the Soviets. Extended lines, disrupted supply chains, and the inability to maintain forward depots left many units without sufficient fuel, ammunition, or medical support. Mechanized formations, dependent on mobility and firepower, were particularly affected. Without fuel or munitions, tanks could not maneuver or sustain offensive pressure, and infantry lacked the necessary artillery support to hold positions. The contrast with German supply efficiency underscored a fundamental principle of modern warfare. The capacity to maintain operational momentum is inseparably tied to the robustness of logistics. Soviet leadership miscalculations compounded these problems. While High Command had envisioned a continuous advance, they underestimated both the operational capabilities of the German forces and the challenges of terrain, weather, and urban defense. Overconfidence, based on previous victories, led to assumptions that German forces were incapable of mounting a rapid, coordinated response. This misjudgment allowed Manstein to execute a counteroffensive with devastating effect, turning Soviet gains into strategic vulnerability and demonstrating the enduring importance of realistic appraisal and contingency planning in military strategy. The psychological dimension of overextension further affected Soviet forces. Units facing encirclement or repeated attacks experienced confusion, fear, and declining morale. Soldiers who had advanced with confidence into Ukraine now found themselves retreating under intense pressure, often without clear orders or support. This cumulative stress impaired decision-making at both the unit and command levels, illustrating how psychological resilience is as critical to operational effectiveness as numbers, equipment, or training. In contrast, German troops, executing a coordinated plan with clear objectives, were reinforced psychologically by initiative, confidence, and visible success. Urban combat magnified Soviet vulnerabilities. Cities like Kharkov became traps for overextended formations. Soviet units, often isolated and poorly coordinated, were forced into close-quarters battles against well-prepared German positions. Mechanized units supported by artillery and engineers systematically cleared urban areas, while infantry exploited gaps, flanked strongpoints, and neutralized pockets of resistance. The failure to secure and consolidate urban positions turned initial territorial gains into liabilities, emphasizing the strategic importance of coordination, preparation, and flexibility when operating in complex terrain. By the end of March 1943, The results of Soviet strategic errors were undeniable. The Red Army had suffered encirclements, significant casualties, and loss of key urban centers. The combination of overextension, logistical strain, command disorganization, and environmental challenges created conditions in which German operational mastery could be fully exploited. The consequences of miscalculated advances highlighted critical lessons for military planners. Numerical superiority and momentum are insufficient without operational depth, secure supply lines, coherent command, and adaptability to changing battlefield conditions. The Battle of Kharkov thus served as both a tactical victory for the Germans and a sobering lesson for the Soviets. While the Red Army had displayed remarkable resilience and tenacity, systemic strategic flaws allowed Manstein's forces to regain the initiative, encircle Soviet formations, and secure one of Germany's last decisive victories on the Eastern Front. The clash of operational art and strategic miscalculation provided enduring insights into the complex dynamics of mechanized warfare, demonstrating that success is a product of coordination, foresight, logistics, and the interplay of both human and environmental factors. In retrospect, the Soviet overextension highlighted the delicate balance between offensive ambition and sustainable operational planning. Each misstep, from dispersed formations to stretched supply lines, created opportunities for the enemy to exploit. The lessons of Kharkov remain relevant. Achieving strategic objectives requires more than momentum. It demands careful planning, integrated logistics, operational flexibility, and the foresight to anticipate and counter enemy actions. The events around Kharkov in 1943 underscore the intricate interplay of strategy, execution, and human resilience that defines the outcomes of high-stakes military engagements. Chapter 13. The Role of Intelligence, Reconnaissance, and Deception. In the Battle of Kharkov, 1943, intelligence and reconnaissance played a critical role in shaping the course of operations. Both German and Soviet forces relied heavily on information about enemy positions, strength, and intentions, but it was the effective integration and utilization of intelligence by the Germans that provided a decisive edge. Manstein's meticulous attention to reconnaissance, coupled with the strategic use of deception, allowed the Wehrmacht to anticipate Soviet movements, exploit vulnerabilities, and orchestrate a counteroffensive that leveraged both surprise and operational precision. The battle illustrated that knowledge of the enemy was as potent a weapon as artillery, tanks, or infantry. German reconnaissance efforts were extensive and multifaceted. A combination of aerial surveillance, forward patrols, and signal intelligence provided commanders with continuous updates on Soviet positions, movements, and logistical constraints. Aircraft flew sorties to observe troop concentrations, track armored formations, and identify potential avenues for mechanized breakthroughs. Forward reconnaissance units moved close to enemy lines, gathering detailed intelligence on terrain, fortifications, and troop dispositions. Radio intercepts and decoding operations further enriched the German understanding of Soviet intentions, enabling them to anticipate attacks, identify weak points, and prepare countermeasures with remarkable accuracy. Deception, or maskirovka, was a cornerstone of German operational planning. By misleading the Soviets about the strength, direction, or timing of their counteroffensive, German forces could create confusion, induce miscalculations, and draw enemy units into vulnerable positions. Fake troop movements, staged artillery barges, and controlled radio traffic were employed to create the illusion of strength or to conceal the timing of key maneuvers. This deception allowed mechanized spearheads to penetrate weakened sectors of the Soviet lines and encircle units that were overextended or poorly coordinated, amplifying the effectiveness of operational planning. The Soviets, while employing their own reconnaissance efforts, faced significant challenges in the accuracy and timeliness of intelligence. Rapid advances, disrupted communications, and fragmented units often limited their capacity to gather, process, and act on information effectively. Reconnaissance reports were sometimes delayed or misinterpreted, creating gaps in situational awareness. The inability to anticipate the German counteroffensive, coupled with overconfidence in their forward positions, left Soviet formations vulnerable to surprise maneuvers and operational encirclements, emphasizing how intelligence failures can magnify the consequences of strategic overextension. Intelligence played a direct role in the execution of mechanized operations. German armored units relied on up-to-date reconnaissance to identify weak points in Soviet lines, select optimal routes for rapid advancement, and avoid potential ambushes. Infantry and artillery units coordinated based on the latest information, ensuring that attacks were synchronized and targeted effectively. Engineers used reconnaissance data to determine which obstacles needed clearing and which terrain offered tactical advantages. This integration of intelligence with operational planning demonstrated that effective reconnaissance could transform battlefield knowledge into decisive action, turning insight into tangible operational outcomes. Urban combat added complexity to intelligence operations. Streets, industrial zones, and residential districts created dense and chaotic environments where identifying enemy positions was challenging. German reconnaissance teams adapted by using aerial photography, patrols, and local intelligence to pinpoint strong points and supply depots. This information allowed infantry and mechanized units to plan precise assaults, minimize casualties, and maintain operational momentum. In contrast, Soviet intelligence faced disruption due to rapid German advances, fragmented communication, and the chaotic nature of urban terrain, further exacerbating the challenges of coordination and response. The psychological dimension of intelligence should not be overlooked. Accurate information, when used effectively, can boost morale, instill confidence in operational planning, and create a sense of control over the battlefield. Conversely, misinformation, uncertainty, or intelligence failures can erode cohesion, induce fear, and lead to miscalculations. German forces, guided by effective reconnaissance and deception, maintained initiative and operational dominance, while Soviet units often reacted to incomplete or misleading information, contributing to tactical errors and strategic setbacks. By mid-March 1943, intelligence and reconnaissance had become a decisive factor in the Battle of Kharkov. German operational plans, informed by detailed, accurate, and timely information, allowed the Wehrmacht to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities, maintain initiative, and conduct a highly coordinated counteroffensive. The integration of intelligence with mechanized operations, urban tactics, and logistical planning demonstrated the centrality of information in modern warfare, illustrating that even superior numbers can be neutralized by a combination of insight, deception, and operational precision. As the German counteroffensive continued, the role of intelligence and reconnaissance became even more critical in shaping battlefield outcomes. Manstein's forces were able to execute complex maneuvers because they possessed detailed knowledge of Soviet dispositions and the operational environment. Reconnaissance units continuously monitored enemy movements, mapped terrain obstacles, and identified key logistical hubs. This ongoing flow of information allowed German commanders to adjust tactics in real time, exploit weaknesses in Soviet formations, and maintain momentum even in the dynamic, chaotic conditions of urban and open field combat. Deception operations amplified the impact of accurate intelligence. By deliberately feeding misleading information, conducting feints, and simulating troop movements, German forces were able to manipulate Soviet perceptions of the battlefield. The Red Army often overcommit to positions that appeared strategically important but were, in fact, designed to draw them into traps. Maskirovka tactics forced Soviet commanders to react to perceived threats rather than real ones, creating opportunities for encirclement and disruption. The effectiveness of this approach demonstrated the interplay between psychological operations and operational planning. Where perception itself could become a decisive weapon, the timing of reconnaissance reports was equally vital. Early detection of Soviet troop movements allowed German units to prepare ambushes, reinforce vulnerable sectors, and position mechanized units for rapid exploitation. Units operating with outdated or inaccurate information were at a disadvantage, underscoring the importance of speed, accuracy, and continuous intelligence gathering. German operational success around Kharkov relied on this real-time integration of reconnaissance into both strategic and tactical planning, highlighting the direct link between information superiority and battlefield effectiveness. Urban combat further emphasized the importance of intelligence. Factories, residential districts, and industrial zones were densely packed and offered countless hiding spots for defenders. German reconnaissance teams, using aerial photography, forward scouts, and captured intelligence, identified Soviet strongpoints and supply routes. This allowed infantry to advance with reduced risk, mechanized units to bypass heavily defended areas, and artillery to target critical positions effectively. Conversely, Soviet intelligence was hampered by disrupted communications, rapid German maneuvers, and the complexity of urban terrain, limiting their ability to respond to German advances and making them vulnerable to encirclement and attrition. The coordination of intelligence with logistics and maneuver operations created a feedback loop that enhanced operational efficiency. Reconnaissance data informed decisions about where to allocate fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, ensuring that mechanized spearheads could strike at the right place and time. Engineers relied on intelligence to maintain mobility, clear obstacles, and secure critical infrastructure. Artillery units adjusted firing positions based on up-to-date information about enemy dispositions. This seamless integration of reconnaissance, logistics, and combat operations exemplified the German approach to operational art, where every decision was informed by accurate, actionable intelligence. Psychological impact remained a key element of intelligence operations. Knowing the enemy's weaknesses and positions instilled confidence in German troops, allowing them to advance with initiative and cohesion. In contrast, Soviet units, often unaware of German movements or deceived by counterintelligence, experienced uncertainty, hesitation, and stress. This imbalance in situational awareness magnified the effectiveness of the German counteroffensive, as Soviet reactions were increasingly reactive rather than proactive, creating opportunities for encirclement and attrition that decisively shaped the battle's outcome. The culmination of reconnaissance and deception efforts was evident in the operational encirclements and the systematic clearing of urban sectors. German forces were able to isolate Soviet units, concentrate firepower where it would have maximum effect, and maintain operational momentum without overextending. Intelligence allowed commanders to anticipate Soviet reactions, adapt tactics in real time, and exploit every vulnerability. The integration of information superiority with mechanized mobility, urban combat strategies, and artillery coordination underscored the multifaceted role of intelligence in modern warfare. By the final stages of the counteroffensive, the impact of intelligence and deception was unmistakable. German operational mastery at Kharkov was not achieved through brute force alone, but through the strategic use of knowledge, anticipation, and psychological leverage. Reconnaissance, coupled with carefully orchestrated deception, allowed the Wehrmacht to maintain initiative, achieve tactical surprise, and turn Soviet overextension into decisive operational advantage. The lessons of Kharkov highlight the enduring truth that in warfare, information is as critical as firepower, logistics, or numerical superiority, shaping the course of battles and ultimately determining the outcome of campaigns. Chapter 14: The Human Dimension, Soldiers' Experiences and Resilience. While strategy, intelligence, and logistics defined the operational framework of the Battle of Kharkov in 1943, the human dimension remained central to the unfolding conflict. The soldiers on both sides endured extreme hardships, harsh winter conditions, relentless combat, and the constant psychological stress of life and death in one of the Eastern Front's most brutal engagements. Their experiences shaped not only tactical outcomes, but also the operational tempo, morale, and resilience of entire units. Understanding the human factor provides an essential lens through which to comprehend how the battle was fought and ultimately decided. German soldiers faced a unique combination of challenges and motivations. The winter of 1942 to 1943 had tested the Wehrmacht's endurance during the Soviet counteroffensives following Stalingrad. By the time of the Kharkov counteroffensive, troops were already hardened by months of exposure to extreme cold, long marches, and limited rations. Yet this adversity had forged cohesion and discipline. Soldiers relied on training, unit solidarity, and the confidence instilled by decisive leadership to navigate the chaos of urban combat and mechanized operations. Despite fatigue and the psychological toll of continuous engagement, German troops displayed remarkable resilience, allowing Manstein's meticulously planned maneuvers to be executed with precision. For Soviet soldiers, the human dimension presented both courage and vulnerability. Red Army units had experienced a series of hard-fought victories during the winter offensives, creating a sense of optimism and momentum. However, rapid advances and overextension left many units isolated and inadequately supplied. Exposure to freezing temperatures, artillery bombardment, and mechanized assaults exacted a heavy toll. Soldiers were forced into reactive defensive positions, often with insufficient information about enemy movements or reinforcements. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, acts of extraordinary endurance, ingenuity, and determination emerged, demonstrating the resilience and resourcefulness of individuals confronting overwhelming challenges. Urban combat magnified the human strain of warfare. Soldiers were required to clear buildings, navigate narrow streets, and engage in close-quarters combat under constant threat from snipers, hidden machine guns, and improvised explosives. The psychological pressure was immense. Every doorway could conceal a lethal ambush, every rooftop a sniper's vantage point. Fatigue, fear, and confusion compounded the physical dangers, yet soldiers on both sides adapted through teamwork, improvisation, and reliance on training. Success often hinged on the ability of small units to act decisively and cohesively under intense stress. The winter environment added layers of complexity to the human experience. Freezing temperatures, icy streets, and snow-covered rubble created hazards for movement, transport, and survival. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion were constant threats. German troops, while experienced and supplied efficiently, still faced these conditions during prolonged engagements, requiring strict discipline, rotation of units, and careful logistical support. Soviet soldiers, often operating under disrupted supply lines and extended deployments, suffered disproportionately, illustrating how environmental factors can exacerbate the human cost of warfare and influence operational effectiveness. Psychological resilience played a decisive role in maintaining operational momentum. German units drew strength from clear objectives, strong leadership, and coordinated tactics. Knowledge that each movement was part of a larger, decisive plan bolstered morale and mitigated the fear induced by urban and mechanized combat. For Soviet soldiers, the absence of such clarity, coupled with rapid German advances and encirclement threats, created heightened stress and reduced cohesion. Individual acts of courage, however, occasionally turned the tide in localized engagements, reflecting the unpredictable interplay between human initiative and structured military planning. The interaction between soldiers and mechanized warfare also shaped human experience. Tank crews, infantry squads, and artillery units had to coordinate seamlessly to navigate urban and open terrain while avoiding friendly fire and maximizing combat effectiveness. Communication, trust, and adaptability were essential, with errors potentially resulting in catastrophic consequences. The human element thus became inseparable from operational outcomes, demonstrating that success in battle required both disciplined execution and the capacity to respond creatively to unexpected challenges. In addition to direct combat, the human experience encompassed logistical labor, reconnaissance, medical support, and engineering tasks. Soldiers and support personnel worked tirelessly to maintain mobility, clear obstacles, deliver supplies, and care for the wounded. These often overlooked contributions were critical to sustaining the pace and effectiveness of operations. The resilience, endurance, and coordination of individuals across these varied roles underpinned the Wehrmacht's operational success and influenced the broader dynamics of the counteroffensive. By the midpoint of the Battle of Kharkov, the human dimension had become a defining element of operational success and failure. German soldiers, bolstered by leadership, cohesion, and integrated logistics, maintained initiative and momentum. Soviet troops, despite courage and determination, were constrained by overextension, disrupted supply lines, and the psychological pressure of encirclement. The battle highlighted the profound impact of human factors on combat effectiveness, demonstrating that operational brilliance alone is insufficient without the resilience, skill, and endurance of the soldiers executing it. As the battle intensified, the human dimension continued to shape the outcomes of the conflict in Kharkov. Soldiers' endurance, decision-making, and morale were constantly tested under extreme conditions. For German troops, operational success was not just a product of strategy or firepower. It also depended on their ability to maintain cohesion, discipline, and psychological resilience under the relentless pressures of mechanized and urban combat. The interplay of physical endurance, mental fortitude, and tactical skill was a defining factor in sustaining operational momentum throughout the counteroffensive. Urban engagements demanded extraordinary adaptability. Infantry and armored units often faced unpredictable resistance, requiring split-second decisions that could mean survival or death. German squads, trained for coordinated assaults, relied on drills, prior experience, and mutual trust to navigate streets, clear buildings, and neutralize strongpoints. Soldiers had to assess threats continuously, coordinate with tanks and artillery, and anticipate enemy maneuvers. The constant tension of life-or-death encounters created a highly stressful environment, yet the discipline and cohesion within units allowed operations to proceed methodically despite the chaos surrounding them. For Soviet soldiers, the human toll was severe. Isolated units, cut off from supply and support, faced relentless attacks under freezing conditions. Troops had to improvise defensive positions, conserve ammunition, and endure the psychological strain of encirclement. Morale fluctuated with the intensity of combat, and units often struggled to maintain cohesion under the combined pressure of mechanized assault, artillery bombardment, and urban ambushes. Despite these challenges, acts of individual courage and collective determination occasionally blunted German advances, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of soldiers even in dire circumstances. The winter environment exacerbated physical and psychological stress. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion were ever-present threats. Snow and ice made movement treacherous for infantry and vehicles alike, while damaged infrastructure complicated supply and evacuation. German logistical foresight mitigated many of these issues, ensuring that frontline troops had access to fuel, ammunition, and winter provisions. Soviet forces, however, often faced shortages, compounding fatigue and vulnerability. The harsh conditions not only tested physical endurance, but also shaped morale, decision-making, and operational flexibility, highlighting the profound influence of environment on human performance in warfare. Psychological resilience was closely linked to leadership. German soldiers benefited from clear objectives, visible command presence, and the sense that their actions contributed to a coherent operational plan. This clarity instilled confidence, reinforced cohesion, and allowed troops to perform under extreme stress. In contrast, Soviet soldiers frequently encountered fragmented command, delayed orders, and uncertainty regarding the broader operational picture. The resulting anxiety and confusion increased the difficulty of executing coordinated maneuvers and maintaining morale, illustrating how leadership directly interacts with human resilience to shape combat effectiveness. Mechanized warfare added a unique dimension to the human experience. Tank crews, infantry, and artillery personnel had to coordinate precisely to exploit openings and avoid fratricide. The speed and lethality of mechanized units required constant situational awareness and rapid adaptation. Soldiers needed to balance aggression with caution, acting decisively while remaining mindful of potential risks. These pressures magnified the psychological strain, but also created opportunities for tactical ingenuity and teamwork, emphasizing the integration of human skill and operational capability in shaping battlefield outcomes. Medical and support roles were integral to sustaining human performance. Field medics, engineers, and supply personnel worked under dangerous conditions to treat the wounded, repair equipment, and maintain supply lines. Their efforts directly influenced the endurance and morale of frontline units. Soldiers who knew that logistical and medical support would reach them were able to operate more effectively, demonstrating that the human dimension extends beyond direct combat to encompass the entire operational ecosystem. By late March 1943, the human element had decisively influenced the battle's trajectory. German soldiers' cohesion, resilience, and adaptability allowed them to maintain the initiative and execute Manstein's counteroffensive with precision. Soviet forces, despite courage and determination, were hindered by overextension, disrupted support, and the psychological impact of encirclement and attrition. The Battle of Kharkov highlighted that while strategy, intelligence, and logistics are vital, the experiences, resilience, and adaptability of soldiers are equally crucial in determining the outcome of high-intensity warfare. Chapter 15: Aftermath and Strategic Implications. Germany's Last Eastern Triumph. The conclusion of the Battle of Kharkov in March 1943 marked a pivotal moment on the Eastern Front, representing Germany's last significant triumph before the strategic tide irrevocably shifted against the Wehrmacht. The victory, orchestrated with operational brilliance, precise logistics, effective intelligence, and resilient soldiers, demonstrated the capability of German forces to exploit Soviet weaknesses decisively. Yet, while the battle achieved immediate tactical success, its long-term strategic implications underscored the increasingly tenuous position of Germany in the East. Understanding both the immediate outcomes and broader consequences of Kharkov provides critical insight into the dynamics of World War II at this juncture. Immediately following the counteroffensive, German forces had regained control over Kharkov and surrounding regions, inflicting severe casualties on Soviet units and capturing significant numbers of equipment. The city itself, a key industrial and transportation hub, returned to German hands, providing temporary strategic advantage. Mechanized divisions, artillery units, and infantry had coordinated successfully to encircle and neutralize overextended Soviet forces, achieving objectives that a few weeks prior seemed unattainable. The precision and efficiency of these operations were a testament to Manstein's leadership and the Wehrmacht's operational discipline. However, the victory was not without cost. German forces, despite their tactical success, had suffered casualties and material losses that would be increasingly difficult to replace. Tanks, artillery, and manpower expended during the intense urban and mechanized operations strained already stretched resources. The success at Kharkov was therefore a demonstration of operational mastery rather than a reversal of Germany's declining strategic position. While the battle provided short-term reprieve and boosted morale, it did little to alter the overall trajectory of the Eastern Front, where Soviet industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and operational learning would soon overwhelm German capabilities. For the Soviet Union, the defeat at Kharkov served as both a setback and a learning opportunity. The overextension, coordination failures, and logistical vulnerabilities exposed during the German counteroffensive became instructive for future planning. Soviet commanders absorbed critical lessons in operational depth, the importance of reserves, intelligence integration, and the risks of dispersed offensives without secure lines of supply. While costly in terms of lives and equipment, these experiences informed subsequent operations, including the later offensives that would push the Wehrmacht westward, culminating in strategic advances that Germany could not counter effectively. Strategically, Kharkov illustrated the transitional phase of the Eastern Front. The battle highlighted that German forces, although capable of executing remarkable operational feats, were increasingly reliant on tactical brilliance and opportunistic maneuvers to achieve temporary victories. The Red Army, by contrast, was learning from each engagement, improving coordination, and leveraging its vast resources to compensate for earlier deficiencies. In essence, Kharkov was a fleeting triumph for Germany, a demonstration of expertise against a still recovering adversary rather than a sustainable reversal of the strategic balance. The psychological impact of the battle was profound for both sides. German troops and commanders gained confidence from the successful execution of complex maneuvers and urban operations, reinforcing faith in leadership and operational doctrine. Soviet forces, while demoralized by losses and encirclement, were galvanized by the lessons learned and the recognition of systemic weaknesses. This interplay of morale and operational learning shaped subsequent engagements, demonstrating that battlefield outcomes extend beyond immediate territorial gains or losses, influencing the strategic mindset and adaptive capacity of both sides. Logistics, which had underpinned German success at Kharkov, also revealed its limitations. While supply lines, fuel reserves, and ammunition stocks were effectively coordinated during the battle, the broader German war effort was under increasing strain. Reinforcements were limited, replacements were difficult to mobilize, and sustaining multiple fronts remained a persistent challenge. Kharkov highlighted the tension between operational brilliance in localized engagements and the strategic reality of a protracted, resource-intensive conflict. Germany could achieve victories, but sustaining them in the face of an industrially and demographically superior adversary was increasingly difficult. The battle also reinforced the critical importance of command and decision-making. Manstein's operational genius was contrasted with broader strategic constraints imposed by Hitler's directives and the high-level political military environment. While tactical success was achieved, broader strategic opportunities were limited by the inability to concentrate forces across larger theaters or to exploit momentum for lasting strategic gains. The distinction between operational victory and strategic impact became starkly evident, emphasizing the complex interplay between battlefield achievement and overall war dynamics. By the conclusion of March 1943, Kharkov stood as a testament to German operational skill and the resilience of its forces under Manstein's command. Yet, it simultaneously marked the last instance in which Germany would secure such a decisive victory on the Eastern Front. The subsequent months would see the Red Army consolidate, adapt, and regain initiative, ultimately shifting the strategic balance irreversibly. The battle thus occupies a dual role in history, as a display of operational brilliance and a harbinger of the impending strategic decline of Germany in the East. The aftermath of the Battle of Kharkov in 1943 had far-reaching consequences, both for the immediate operational situation and for the broader strategic trajectory of the Eastern Front. While the Wehrmacht had achieved a remarkable tactical victory, the battle highlighted the fragility of Germany's position in the East and the growing capacity of the Red Army to recover, adapt, and launch successive offensives. Kharkov became a study in contrasts, a last, shining operational success for Germany, juxtaposed with the looming inevitability of strategic reversal that in terms of territorial control, Kharkov's recapture provided Germany with a temporary strategic foothold in southern Ukraine. The city's industrial infrastructure, transportation networks, and surrounding terrain offered operational advantages, allowing the Wehrmacht to regroup and stabilize its front lines. Urban clearing operations, coupled with the systematic reduction of Soviet pockets, restored a measure of order and enabled German forces to establish defensive positions. This immediate gain, however, belied the larger strategic vulnerability. While the Wehrmacht could win battles locally, sustaining such gains across multiple fronts became increasingly difficult as Soviet capacity and operational learning grew. The Red Army's losses at Kharkov were substantial. Encircled units suffered significant casualties, both in personnel and equipment, while the disruption of command and supply chains hindered Soviet operational flexibility. Yet, despite these setbacks, the Soviet Union retained the ability to recover quickly due to its depth of manpower, industrial output, and logistical reserves. The defeat served as a catalyst for introspection and adaptation, informing operational planning, tactical deployment, and coordination of mechanized forces. The lessons learned during Kharkov would underpin subsequent Soviet offensives, demonstrating that battlefield setbacks could simultaneously act as a foundation for future strategic success. Strategically, Kharkov underscored the transitional nature of the Eastern Front in early 1943. The German victory was brilliant in operational execution but limited in long-term effect. The Wehrmacht's reliance on localized tactical superiority and precise operational planning could not compensate for broader strategic disadvantages, including stretched supply lines, diminishing reserves, and the growing proficiency of Soviet forces. Conversely, the Red Army, while temporarily set back, gained invaluable experience in urban warfare, defensive tactics under encirclement, and countering mechanized assaults, all of which would enhance effectiveness in subsequent campaigns. The psychological and moral implications of Kharkov were profound. For German troops and commanders, the victory provided a boost in confidence, reinforcing the belief in operational skill, leadership, and coordination. Soldiers took pride in their ability to execute complex maneuvers under extreme winter conditions and urban combat stress. For the Soviet forces, the setback tested morale but also instilled a recognition of systemic weaknesses that needed correction. Training, coordination, and preparation for future engagements became a priority, demonstrating that even defeats could serve as a catalyst for adaptation and improvement. Logistics, once again, proved central to the battle's outcome and its aftermath. German operational success relied heavily on the synchronization of supply lines, fuel distribution, and ammunition delivery, underscoring the critical importance of logistical planning in modern mechanized warfare. Yet, the temporary nature of these successes highlighted the vulnerability of the Wehrmacht's supply network. Over time, cumulative attrition, resource scarcity, and the pressure of multiple fronts would erode Germany's capacity to repeat such victories, reinforcing the idea that operational brilliance must be complemented by sustainable strategic planning. The leadership dimension remained a decisive factor. Manstein's tactical genius demonstrated the value of foresight, coordination, and initiative in operational planning. However, the constraints imposed by the broader German command structure and strategic overreach limited the ability to transform localized victories into lasting strategic advantage. Kharkov illustrated the distinction between operational mastery on the battlefield and the broader imperatives of war, where political, economic, and industrial factors increasingly dictated the course of campaigns. In the months following Kharkov, the Red Army rebuilt its strength, integrated lessons learned, and prepared for the offensives that would eventually turn the tide on the Eastern Front. The battle's significance lies not only in its immediate tactical outcomes, but also in its role as a catalyst for adaptation and strategic recalibration. Kharkov was both a high point of German operational achievement and a turning point in Soviet strategic development, foreshadowing the relentless advances that would ultimately push the Wehrmacht westward toward eventual defeat. In retrospect, the Battle of Kharkov in 1943 stands as a testament to operational brilliance, the human dimension of warfare, and the interplay between strategy, logistics, intelligence, and leadership. Germany's last great victory on the Eastern Front highlighted the fleeting nature of tactical success in the face of overwhelming strategic realities. The battle remains a profound study in the complexities of mechanized warfare, urban combat, and the enduring importance of adaptability, resilience, and foresight in determining the outcomes of high-stakes conflict.